It was the spring of 1867 when the high country of the Montana Territory began to thaw, revealing the grim reality that the United States Army was not the master of the Bighorn River Valley, but rather a prisoner within its own fortifications. The garrison at Fort C.F. Smith had spent the winter buried under drifts of snow and a heavy blanket of dread, isolated from the rest of the world by 91 miles of hostile terrain, separating them from their nearest neighbor, Fort Phil Kearny. This outpost stood as the northernmost link in the chain of forts intended to guard the Bozeman Trail, a route that had become less of a road to gold fields and more of a gauntlet of certain death. The soldiers stationed here were not conquering heroes expanding a frontier. They were inmates in an adobe and pine stockade, watching the tree lines and ridge lines for the slightest movement that signaled the end of their lives. The geography itself conspired against the invaders. Fort C.F. Smith sat on a bluff overlooking the Bighorn River, a position that offered a command of the immediate ground but felt insignificant against the backdrop of the Bighorn Mountains rising sharply to the east and south. The mountains were a fortress for the Lakota Sioux, the Northern Cheyenne, and the Arapaho, who knew every ravine, coulee, and game trail. Red Cloud, the Oglala Lakota war leader, had orchestrated a campaign not of pitched battles against fort walls but of resource denial. He understood that the blue-coated soldiers required food, wood, and fodder to survive. By cutting off the flow of wagons along the Bozeman Trail, the tribes could turn the forts into starving cages. The winter of 1866 into 1867 had proven the efficacy of this strategy. No supply wagons had broken through the blockade for months. The garrison existed on rotting salt pork, weevil-infested hardtack, and the desperate hope that the spring grass would arrive before the cavalry. Horses died of starvation. Inside the fort, the physical deterioration of the men mirrored the crumbling morale. Scurvy had loosened teeth and blackened gums, turning the simple act of chewing into a painful ordeal. The lack of fresh vegetables or wild game meant that bodies healed slowly, if at all. A minor cut from a wood-chopping accident could fester for weeks. The regimental surgeon had little to offer beyond basic salves and whiskey, neither of which could replace the essential nutrients missing from their diet. Men moved with a lethargy born of malnutrition, their uniforms hanging loosely on frames stripped of fat and muscle. Discipline was maintained through the rigid structure of military life, but the eyes of the enlisted men betrayed a haunting hollowness. They were the 27th Infantry, a regiment formed from the reorganization of older battalions, and many were veterans of the Civil War. They knew violence, but the unpredictability of this guerrilla war gnawed at their nerves in a way the line battles of the East never had. The primary tactical problem facing the command at Fort C.F. Smith was the maintenance of the livestock. A fort in the wilderness was immobile without horses and mules. The cavalry mounts were essential for patrols, escorts, and communication, while the mules were the engines of logistics, pulling wagons of wood and water. Through the long winter, the animals had been fed on meager reserves of grain that were now exhausted. As the snow retreated, the ground around the fort was stripped bare of grazing material. To feed the animals, the soldiers had to venture further out from the safety of the stockade walls. Every excursion for grass or timber became a military operation requiring heavy guards and constant vigilance. The warriors watching from the bluffs knew this necessity well. They waited for the wood trains and the grazing details, striking with sudden, overwhelming violence whenever the soldiers let their guard down or ventured too far into the broken terrain. Colonel Luther P. Bradley, commanding the district, and the officers at C.F. Smith understood that the survival of the post through the coming winter of 1867 and 1868 depended entirely on the harvest of the summer months. They needed to stockpile hundreds of tons of hay to keep the stock alive when the snows returned. The area immediately surrounding the fort was unsuitable for such large-scale harvesting. The grass was too thin, trampled, or overgrazed. The nearest source of quality wild hay was a valley bottom about 2.5 miles northeast of the post along Warman Creek. Here the river bent, creating a fertile meadow where the grass grew thick and tall, fed by the moisture of the bighorn. It was a perfect location for cutting hay, and a perfect location for an ambush. The distance meant that any troops sent there would be beyond the immediate support of the fort's guns. They would be on their own, until a relief column could cover the miles between them. The planning for the haying operation began with a grim calculation of risk versus necessity. The quartermaster needed civilians to do the cutting, as the soldiers were too few and too occupied with guard duty and construction to handle the scythes and mowing machines. A contract was struck with Richards, the civilian hay-cutting contractor, who employed a team of hard-edged frontiersmen to undertake the work. These were not simple farmers, they were men who had drifted west, hardened by the elements and the constant threat of violence. They carried their rifles alongside their tools, and many were as proficient with a breech loader as they were with a pitchfork. The military agreed to provide a permanent guard detail to protect the camp and the workers. It was a symbiotic relationship born of desperation. The civilians needed the army's money, and the army needed the civilians' labor to prevent their horses from starving in the winter. By June, the pressure on the garrison had intensified. The melting snows allowed the tribes to move with greater freedom, and the frequency of skirmishes increased. Every mail carrier who rode out of the fort took his life in his hands. Many did not return. Their bodies found days later, stripped and mutilated, the mail bags scattered across the sagebrush. This severance of communication heightened the sense of isolation. The men at C.F. Smith often had no idea if the other forts were still standing or if the government in Washington had decided to abandon the trail altogether. They were operating in a vacuum of information, reliant only on what they could see from the watchtowers. The psychological toll of this silence was heavy. Rumors spread through the barracks like wildfire, stories of massive war parties gathering, of Fort Phil Kearny falling, of general massacre. The environment itself was indifferent to their plight. The Bighorn River swelled, with the runoff becoming a cold, rushing barrier that was difficult to cross. The sun grew hotter as spring turned toward summer, baking the clay soil and shimmering off the rocks. Dust became a constant companion, coating the lungs and stinging the eyes. The wind that swept down from the mountains carried no relief, only the scent of pine and the dry, earthy smell of the plains. For the sentries walking the parapets, the landscape was a deceptive tapestry of shadows and light. A clump of sagebrush could look like a crouching warrior. A rustle in the dry grass could be the wind or the approach of a sniper. Sleep was fitful, interrupted by the howling of coyotes that sounded too human for comfort. The weaponry available to the garrison during the early months of 1867 was a source of significant anxiety. The standard issue arm was the Springfield rifled musket, a muzzle-loading weapon that had seen service in the Civil War. It was accurate and hit with tremendous force, but its rate of fire was agonizingly slow. A skilled soldier could manage 3 rounds a minute, perhaps 4 under ideal conditions. In the panic of a sudden ambush, fumbling with paper cartridges, ramrods, and percussion caps often led to fatal delays. The warriors of the plains, armed primarily with bows and arrows, could loose a dozen shafts in the time it took a soldier to reload once. At close range, this volume of fire was overwhelming. While some of the warriors possessed firearms, trade muskets or captured revolvers, their true advantage lay in their mobility and their ability to exploit the slow reloading cycle of the soldiers. The officers knew that if a large force of warriors could close the distance before the soldiers could reload, a massacre was inevitable. This was the lesson of the Fetterman fight the previous December, where 81 men had been wiped out in minutes, overwhelmed by superior numbers while trying to reload. However, a technological shift was on the horizon, though it had not yet fully transformed the tactical reality at Fort C.F. Smith in the spring. The Army was in the process of distributing the new Allen conversion rifles known as the Springfield Model 1866. These weapons took the existing stock of muzzle loaders and modified them with a trap-door breech mechanism, allowing the soldier to insert a metallic cartridge directly into the rear of the barrel. This simple change increased the rate of fire to 15 or 20 rounds a minute and allowed the soldier to reload while lying prone, a crucial advantage when under fire. But in the early months of the year, these weapons were scarce. The garrison trained with what they had, drilling the loading sequence of the muzzle loaders until it was muscle memory, praying they would not have to rely on it against a rushing tide of enemies. The civilian hay cutters, by contrast, were often better armed than the soldiers they relied on for protection. Men like Al Colvin and Zeke Colvin invested their own money in the latest repeating rifles coming out of the eastern factories. The Henry lever-action rifle and the Spencer carbine offered firepower that was nearly miraculous compared to the single-shot muskets. A man with a Henry could fire 16 rounds without reloading. These weapons were expensive and the ammunition was heavy, but for men whose lives depended on their ability to repel sudden violence, the cost was irrelevant. These repeating rifles were force multipliers, allowing a single man to exert the suppression capability of a squad. The presence of these weapons among the civilian crew would prove to be a decisive factor in the months to come, a variable the observing warriors could not easily account for from a distance. As the weeks dragged on, the necessity of the haying operation became the singular focus of the post's logistics. The quartermaster surveyed the equipment: mowing machines that needed grease and sharpening, wagons with dried-out axles that needed soaking, and harness leather that had grown stiff and brittle. The preparation was meticulous because a breakdown in the field could be fatal. A broken wheel on a wagon 2 miles from the fort would turn a transport mission into a defensive stand. The blacksmiths worked long hours at the forge, hammering out repairs and spare parts. The sound of the hammer on the anvil rang out across the parade ground, a rhythmic counterpoint to the bugle calls that marked the passage of the day. The relationship between the soldiers and the local ecosystem was purely adversarial. They cut down the cottonwoods for timber, changing the shape of the riverbanks. They hunted the local game to near extinction within a 5-mile radius, forcing them to rely even more heavily on the supply wagons that never came. The disruption of the natural order did not go unnoticed by the tribes. To the Lakota and Cheyenne, the fort was a festering wound in the land, a source of pollution and noise that drove away the buffalo and disrespected the spirits of the place. Their surveillance was constant. Scouts lay on the high ridges for hours, motionless, cataloging the routines of the bluecoats. They noted the time the gates opened, the number of men on detail, the routes taken by the water wagons. They were gathering intelligence with the sophistication of a modern army, looking for the pattern that would reveal a weakness. By July, the grass in the river bottom had reached its peak height. It waved in the summer breeze, a lush green carpet that promised salvation for the livestock. The decision was made. The haying operation would commence. A permanent camp would be established at the hayfield to avoid the time-consuming commute back and forth to the fort every day. This decision increased the risk exponentially. The men would be sleeping 2.5 miles from help, isolated in the darkness. To mitigate this, they would need fortification. They would need a structure that could withstand a sudden assault, something more substantial than canvas tents. The selection of the specific site in the hayfield was driven by the terrain. It needed to be close to the best grass but situated on defensible ground. The officers and the civilian foreman rode out to scout the location, their eyes scanning the horizon for the glint of a mirror signal or the dust of a pony. They chose a spot near a break in the riverbank, where the ground was relatively flat and offered clear fields of fire for a few hundred yards. It was not a perfect fortress. The high grass itself offered cover for approaching enemies, but it was the best option available. The tension during this reconnaissance was palpable. Every man rode with his weapon across his lap, his thumb near the hammer. The air was thick with the silent threat of the unseen enemy. The logistical movement to establish the camp was a major operation. Wagons piled high with tools, tents, and supplies rolled out of the fort's main gate, flanked by a heavy escort of infantry. The wheels ground into the dry earth, kicking up clouds of dust that marked their progress for miles. The soldiers marched in columns, their eyes darting to the ravines that lined the trail. They knew that once they established the camp, the umbilical cord to the fort would be thin. They would be an outpost of an outpost, the tip of the spear thrust into hostile territory. The fear was not of the unknown, but of the known capabilities of the warriors who held the high ground. As the camp was established, the daily rhythm of the hayfield began to take shape, a rhythm defined by hard labor and high anxiety. The mowing machines were loud, their clattering blades drowning out the sounds of the environment. This acoustic blindness was a danger in itself. A man on a mower might not hear the approach of a horse or the warning shout of a sentry. To compensate, guard posts were established on the perimeter, pickets stationed on the higher ground to provide early warning. These men stood for hours in the baking sun, straining their eyes against the glare, looking for the unnatural movement, the flash of color, the disturbance of birds that would indicate an intruder. The isolation of the hayfield detachment was absolute. At night, the darkness was total, save for the stars and the faint glow of the campfires, which were kept small and low. The silence of the plains was heavy, broken only by the rushing of the river and the stamping of the mules in their picket lines. The men slept with their weapons within arm's reach, often waking at the slightest sound. The psychological strain of this constant readiness began to wear on them. Tempers flared over minor infractions. The food tasted like dust. The water from the river, though fresh, could not wash away the metallic taste of fear. They were living in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the blow they knew was coming. Red Cloud's coalition was not idle during these preparations. The tribes were gathering. From the distinct bands of the Lakota, the Oglala, the Miniconjou, the Sanzark, and from the camps of the northern Cheyenne and the Arapaho, warriors were moving toward the Bighorn. They were motivated by the successes of the previous year, and the vision of driving the invaders out completely. The hayfield represented a target of opportunity. It was a weakness in the armor of the fort, a soft spot where the soldiers had extended themselves too far. The scouts reported back to the main camps, describing the number of men, the layout of the camp, and the quality of the horses. The council fires burned late into the night as the war chiefs debated the timing and the tactics of the strike. They did not intend to merely harass the cutters. They intended to wipe them out entirely, to replicate the victory over Fetterman and send a message that the Bozeman Trail was closed forever. The soldiers at the hayfield, sweating through their wool uniforms, as they pitched tents and dug latrines, could feel the eyes upon them. They were 19 enlisted men and 6 civilians, a tiny force against the vastness of the landscape and the multitude of the nations arrayed against them. They were about to step into a crucible that would test the limits of their endurance and the effectiveness of their technology. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the long fuse of the summer of 1867 was burning down toward the powder keg. It was early July 1867 when the men standing in the center of the river valley realized that their only hope for longevity lay in the crude manipulation of the earth and wood scattered around them. The sun beat down on the hayfield with a relentless intensity that turned the air into a shimmering haze. distorting the view of the distant bluffs where the enemy was surely watching. This was not a place for grand military engineering or stone masonry. It was a place where survival demanded improvisation. The detachment had moved out from the main post of Fort C.F. Smith to this designated harvest zone, a stretch of bottomland nestled along Warman Creek, and their immediate priority shifted from the abstract concept of war to the physical reality of construction. They needed a shell to crawl into when the arrow storms eventually arrived. The site selected for this fortification was not a hilltop fortress, but a functional corral situated on the flat ground near the riverbank. The location was dictated by logistics rather than tactical supremacy. The mules and horses needed to be close to the hay they were hauling and the water they drank. The ground here was hard-packed clay and loam, baked solid by the summer heat, resisting the blades of the shovels as the soldiers broke the soil to dig the foundation trenches. Lieutenant Sigismund Sternberg, the young officer in command of the detail, oversaw the layout. He marked out a rough square, approximately 100 feet by 60 feet, a footprint large enough to hold the animals and the men, but small enough to be defended by a handful of rifles. Building materials were scarce in the high plains. There were no quarries for stone and no forests of hardwood nearby to provide neat, square timbers. The men had to scavenge. They turned to the riverbank, where thickets of willow and gnarled cottonwood grew in tangled masses. The work detail moved into the brush with axes, their strokes echoing off the water. They felled the heavy logs for the main uprights, dragging them back to the site with teams of sweating mules. These primary posts were sunk deep into the earth at intervals, providing the skeleton of the stockade. The labor was backbreaking. Men stripped to their undershirts, their skin turning angry shades of red and brown under the solar assault. Their hands calloused and blistered from the friction of the axe handles. Between these heavy uprights, the defenders employed a technique that was more agricultural than martial. They gathered lighter willow branches, flexible and green, and wove them horizontally between the posts. It was a wickerwork design similar to how one might craft a basket, but on a massive, crude scale. This lattice created a container, a double wall with a hollow space in the center. The genius of the design lay in what came next. The men took up their shovels again and filled the void between the willow walls with dirt and gravel dug from the trench, surrounding the perimeter. As they packed the earth down, tamping it solid with heavy beams, the structure transformed. It became a dense, impact-absorbing barrier capable of stopping a heavy-caliber slug or a flint-tipped arrow. The walls rose slowly, foot by agonizing foot. They were not high, barely reaching the chest of a tall man in some places, but they were thick. To supplement the willow and dirt, heavy logs were laid horizontally on top of the wicker sections, weighed down with large rocks to prevent them from shifting. This created a fighting position where a man could kneel or lie prone, firing through the gaps or over the top while his body remained shielded by the earth-packed mass. The corral was ugly, a scarring lump on the smooth face of the meadow, but it was solid. It smelled of raw sap, turned earth, and the sweat of the men who built it. Inside this perimeter, the architecture of daily life took shape. The sheer necessity of the haying operation meant that the enclosure had to serve as a barn, a barracks, and a warehouse simultaneously. At the rear of the corral, nearest the river, the men set up the picket lines for the livestock. Heavy ropes were strung between posts where the mules and cavalry horses would be tied at night. The ground here was quickly churned into a mixture of dust and manure, attracting swarms of biting flies that plagued the animals constantly. The flicking of tails and the stamping of hooves became the background rhythm of the camp, a constant reminder of the precious cargo they were there to protect. Canvas army tents were pitched in a haphazard line along the interior of the walls. These provided little relief from the heat, acting more as ovens during the midday hours. but they offered a psychological separation from the open sky and the prying eyes on the ridges. The soldiers and the civilian contractors slept side by side, their bedrolls laid out on the hard ground. Personal space was non-existent. A man's world shrank to the few feet of dirt where he placed his rifle and his canteen. The intimacy of the space meant that hygiene deteriorated rapidly. Water was hauled from the river in buckets, but it was reserved primarily for drinking and cooking. Bathing was a luxury that few risked, as the riverbank was a dangerous place to be caught unarmed and naked. To combat the sun, the men constructed bowers within the corral. These were crude shelters made by laying brush and leafy branches over a framework of poles. The drying leaves provided a dappled shade that was significantly cooler than the interior of the tents. It was under these bowers that the off-duty men would sit, cleaning their weapons, mending their uniforms, or playing cards with a grease-stained deck. The air under the brush smelled of drying vegetation and tobacco smoke. It was here that the social hierarchy of the camp dissolved into a shared misery. Al Colvin and the other civilians, rough men with a mercenary edge, mingled with the enlisted soldiers of the 27th Infantry. They compared weapons, swapped stories of the trail, and speculated on when the attack would come. Outside the walls, the actual work of the hayfield proceeded with mechanical monotony. The mowing machines were the technological marvels of the operation. Drawn by teams of horses, these iron contraptions featured a reciprocating blade that sliced through the tall grass with a rhythmic clattering noise. The sound was loud, an industrial intrusion in the natural silence. The operators sat on iron seats, exposed and vulnerable, guiding the teams in long, straight lines. As the grass fell, other men followed with pitchforks and rakes, gathering the hay into windrows to dry before it could be loaded onto the wagons. The work required a high degree of coordination. The mowers had to keep moving to meet the quota, but they could not stray too far from the protection of the riflemen stationed at the perimeter of the work zone. The environment of the hayfield was deceptive. The grass was waist-high in places, lush and green near the water, turning to a golden yellow as the land rose toward the bluffs. This vegetation was the prize, but it was also the danger. A warrior could crawl through the grass on his belly, completely invisible until he was within striking distance. The workers operated in a state of constant paranoia. Every rustle of the wind, every sudden flight of a meadowlark, caused heads to snap up and hands to reach for weapons. The scythes and pitchforks were tools of the trade, but every man kept a firearm strapped to his body or resting on the wagon seat next to him. The heat of July was a physical adversary. The temperature in the river bottom often soared well above 100 degrees. The air was still and heavy, trapping the heat against the ground. Sweat soaked through the wool uniforms of the soldiers, causing chafing and rashes that made every movement uncomfortable. The metal of the tools and guns became too hot to touch without gloves. Dehydration was a constant threat. The water in the canteens grew warm and stale within an hour. Men moved with a deliberate slowness to conserve energy, their faces caked in a paste of dust and perspiration. The glare of the sun off the dry ground forced them to squint constantly, deepening the crow's feet around their eyes. Security for the operation relied on a system of pickets. These were solitary sentries posted on the high ground overlooking the valley. It was the loneliest and most dangerous job in the detachment. A picket would hike out before dawn, finding a position among the rocks or sagebrush where he could see the approaches from the mountains. He would lie there for hours, baking in the sun, unable to move or make a sound for fear of revealing his position. His only connection to the main group was visual. If he saw dust rising or the movement of mounted men, he would signal, firing a shot or waving a coat to warn the workers below. The men in the hayfield trusted their lives to these distant figures, knowing that if the picket fell asleep or was silently neutralized, the first warning they would get would be the scream of the attacking force. The logistics of the camp extended to the kitchen, such as it was. A cooking fire was maintained in a pit near the center of the corral. The diet was monotonous and hard on the constitution. Salt pork, heavily preserved and incredibly salty, was the staple protein. It was boiled or fried, rendering out the grease which was then used to soften the hardtack biscuits. Coffee was brewed strong and black in large kettles, the grounds often reused until the liquid was barely brown. Occasionally, the hunters would bring in an antelope or a deer, providing a feast of fresh meat that improved morale significantly. But mostly the men ate to fuel their labor, chewing mechanically on tough rations while swatting away the flies that swarmed the food the moment it was exposed. The wagon corral itself was not just a static structure. It was a dynamic storage facility. As the hay was cut and dried, it was loaded onto the wagons. These wagons were then parked inside or immediately adjacent to the log enclosure, creating additional barriers. The sheer bulk of a loaded hay wagon offered excellent cover from gunfire, though it presented a severe fire risk. The quartermaster had issued heavy tarps to cover the hay, protecting it from sudden summer thunderstorms that rolled off the mountains with violence. These storms brought lightning that jagged across the sky and thunder that shook the ground, momentarily drowning out the anxiety of the weight. The rain turned the clay floor of the corral into a slick, adhesive mud that clung to boots and hooves, making movement difficult until the sun returned to bake it hard again. Within the enclosure, the weaponry was treated with religious reverence. The soldiers of the 27th Infantry were transitioning between weapon systems, but at the hayfield, the reality of the impending conflict dictated their habits. Ammunition crates were pried open, the copper casings of the new metallic cartridges glinting in the light. The men spent their evenings wiping down the breech blocks of the trapdoor Springfields, ensuring the firing pins moved freely and the extractors caught the rim of the cartridge every time. The civilians, with their repeating Spencers and Henrys, loaded the tubular magazines, feeling the weight of the 16 rounds that gave them a firepower advantage disproportionate to their numbers. They kept these weapons clean of the ubiquitous dust, wrapping the actions in oiled rags when not in use. The relationship between the corral and the main fort, 2.5 miles away, was one of visual separation. From the hayfield, the fort was hidden by the curvature of the terrain and the intervening ridges. The men were effectively on an island. If a fight started, the sound of gunfire might drift back to the post, but visual signals were blocked. This meant that the reaction time for any relief column would be delayed. The defenders of the corral knew that if they were attacked, they would have to hold for hours on their own. This knowledge influenced the way they reinforced the logs. They piled the dirt higher. They dug shallow rifle pits just inside the walls to allow them to sit lower. They cleared the brush immediately around the exterior of the corral to remove cover for anyone trying to rush the walls. As July wore on, the haystacks inside the corral grew, symbols of the mission's success but also ticking clocks. The more hay they cut, the more successful the operation, but the longer they stayed, the more certain the attack became. The warriors watching from the hills could see the progress. They knew the rhythms of the mowing machines. They knew when the men stopped for the midday meal. The construction of the corral had been an act of defiance, a statement that the soldiers intended to stay. The logs, gray and weathering in the sun, were the line in the sand. The nights in the corral were the hardest. The heat of the day radiated back up from the ground, keeping the air warm long after sunset. The darkness was absolute, a heavy velvet curtain that hid everything beyond the walls. The sentries walked the interior perimeter, their boots crunching softly on the gravel. Every snap of a twig in the river bottom sounded like a footfall. The mules would occasionally snort or shift, their ears swiveling toward the darkness, sensing things the men could not. Sleep was light and fitful. Men dreamed of arrow flights and burning wagons, waking with a start, their hands grasping for the cold steel of a rifle barrel before their eyes were even open. The architecture of the corral offered physical protection, but it could not wall out the psychological pressure of the siege that had not yet begun. By the end of the month, the fortification was as complete as it would ever be. The willow walls were packed tight, the logs were settled, and the routine was established. The men had transformed a patch of open ground into a bastion. It was ugly, hot, and smelled of animals and unwashed men, but it was theirs. It was the only thing standing between them and the gathering storm on the horizon. The corral was a testament to the stubbornness of the infantry and the pragmatism of the frontiersmen, a wooden island built to withstand a flood of violence. By late July 1867, the vast rolling expanse of the Powder River country concealed a mobilization of human force that rivaled the great armies of history in density and intent. While the soldiers in the hayfield sweated over their willow logs, a storm was coalescing in the deep valleys and along the tributaries of the Tongue and Rosebud rivers. This was not a raiding party of a dozen hot-blooded youth seeking horses. It was a national movement. The Lakota Sioux, the Northern Cheyenne, and the Arapaho had come together in a grand coalition, driven by the singular purpose of erasing the military presence from their hunting grounds. The camps that sprawled along the riverbanks were cities of hide and lodge poles, stretching for miles, housing thousands of people and tens of thousands of ponies. The sheer scale of the gathering was a testament to the desperation and the resolve of the tribes. The impetus for this massive assembly was the annual sun dance, a sacred ceremony of renewal and sacrifice that had just concluded. The spiritual energy generated by the dance had galvanized the warriors. Men who had spent days fasting and dancing, staring into the sun and dragging buffalo skulls attached to their flesh by skewers, were now ready to channel that pain and power into war. The political leadership, the council of chiefs and headmen, harnessed this fervor. They debated strategy not in terms of minor skirmishes, but in terms of total annihilation. The previous year's victory over Fetterman had proven that the Bluecoats could be killed in large numbers if they were drawn out of their forts. The strategy now was to replicate that success on a grander scale. The debate in the council lodges was intense. Red Cloud, the Oglala strategist who had orchestrated the blockade of the Bozeman Trail, held immense sway. But the Cheyenne were equally vocal. The decision was made to split the massive force. One army, consisting primarily of Oglala under Crazy Horse and others, would strike south at Fort Phil Kearny. The second army, a coalition of Northern Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Minneconjou Sioux, would turn north to crush Fort C.F. Smith. This northern force, numbering nearly 1,000 warriors, turned its eyes toward the Bighorn River. The target was not the fort walls, which were impregnable to men without cannons, but the isolated detachments that ventured out to steal the grass. The movement of this army was a logistical feat. To move 1,000 men and their mounts across the broken terrain required discipline and planning. The war party moved in columns that utilized the natural contours of the land to mask their approach. They rode through the deep coulees and along the dry creek beds, keeping below the skylines. Dust control was paramount. If the soldiers saw a massive dust cloud rising in the east, the element of surprise would be lost. The vanguard rode slowly, keeping the pace deliberate to minimize the disturbance of the earth. The rear guard ensured that stragglers kept up and that no sign of their passing was left for a patrol to find. The demographic of the war party was a cross-section of the Plains warrior culture. There were the seasoned veterans, men in their 30s and 40s, who carried the scars of intertribal warfare and fights with the soldiers. They rode with a calm assurance, their faces set in grim lines. Then there were the young men, the teenagers for whom this would be a proving ground. They were eager, their horses painted with symbols of speed and protection, their bodies adorned with the markings of their societies. The dog soldiers, the elk scrapers, and the fox soldiers rode together, their society insignias marking them as elite fighting units within the larger mass. The weaponry carried by this 1,000-strong force was a study in contrasts. The primary weapon for the majority of the warriors was still the bow and arrow, constructed from ash or hickory backed with sinew for elasticity. These bows were lethal instruments. A skilled archer could loose a dozen arrows in the time it took a soldier to reload a musket. The arrows, tipped with hoop iron or flint, could penetrate a buffalo at 50 yards. In the hands of these men, the bow was a rapid-fire weapon, silent and terrifying. They carried quivers filled with 40 or 50 shafts, a magazine capacity that far exceeded the soldiers' cartridge boxes. However, the tribes also possessed firearms. Through trade, raid, and capture, they had acquired a motley arsenal. There were old smoothbore flintlock muskets, relics of the fur trade era that were slow to load and inaccurate beyond close range. There were cap and ball revolvers taken from dead soldiers or purchased from unscrupulous traders. Some men carried Spencer carbines or Sharps rifles captured in previous fights, but these were rare, and the ammunition for them was precious. The warriors with guns often had little powder and lead, forcing them to conserve their shots for the moment of greatest impact. They did not rely on marksmanship from a distance. They relied on closing the range until the inaccuracy of their weapons was irrelevant. The tactical philosophy of the coalition relied heavily on brute force and overwhelming numbers. They knew the soldiers at the hayfield were few. Their scouts had watched the mowing operations for days, counting the men, noting the position of the sentries, and mapping the layout of the corral. They saw 19 soldiers and 6 civilians. Against 1,000 warriors, the math was simple. They planned to swarm the position like a river breaching a dam. The initial rush would absorb the first volley of soldier fire, and before the bluecoats could reload their muzzle loaders, the wave of warriors would be over the walls. It was a strategy based on the known limitations of the Springfield musket. They did not know the soldiers had changed their weapons. The environment through which they rode was harsh and unyielding. The July heat baked the rocks and the sagebrush, reflecting a glare that punished the eyes. The warriors rode stripped to the waist, their skin bronzed and painted. They carried little water, conditioned to endure thirst that would incapacitate a white man. Their ponies were tough, grass-fed animals that could travel 50 miles a day without faltering. The bond between the warrior and his horse was absolute. They moved as a single organism, guided by knee pressure and shifts in weight rather than heavy bits and reins. As the column approached the Bighorn Valley, the chief sent forward the wolves, the elite scouts who would finalize the attack plan. These men crept onto the high bluffs overlooking the hayfield. They lay flat on their bellies, peering through the tall grass, their eyes dissecting the defenses. They saw the log corral, the picket line of mules, and the mowing machines working the bottoms. They noted the lethargy of the soldiers, the casual way they moved in the heat. It confirmed their belief that the enemy was unaware and unprepared. The scouts signaled back to the main body, using mirrors to flash silent messages across the miles. The trap was set. The prey was grazing. The convergence of the tribes brought with it a complex social dynamic. The Cheyenne and the Sioux were allies, but they were also rivals for glory. Each tribe wanted to be the first to strike the blow, the first to count coup on the enemy. This rivalry added a dangerous energy to the war party. The chiefs had to work hard to restrain the young men from rushing in prematurely. Discipline was maintained by the warrior societies, whose members would whip any man who broke the line or attacked before the signal. The attack had to be coordinated. It had to be a single crushing blow, not a ragged series of skirmishes. The warriors prepared themselves spiritually for the coming violence. They stopped in the ravines and creek beds miles from the objective to apply their war paint. Each color and design had specific meaning: yellow for the sun, black for victory, red for blood and power. They unpacked their medicine bundles, taking out sacred objects that they believed would turn bullets and protect them from harm. Eagle feathers were tied into hair. Shields made of thick buffalo hide were checked and rechecked. This was not just a physical preparation. It was a ritual arming of the soul. They believed that if their medicine was strong and their hearts were pure, they could not be defeated. The sheer mass of the war party meant that they could not simply ride down the main trail. They fanned out, moving through the parallel ravines and behind the ridge lines that define the geography of the area. This allowed them to envelop the hayfield from multiple directions. The plan was to cut off the retreat to the fort, surround the corral, and then tighten the noose. A large contingent moved to block the road to Fort C.F. Smith, ensuring that no relief column could break through easily. Another group moved into the river bottom, using the heavy brush along the banks to creep close to the rear of the corral. The main body prepared to charge from the bluffs to the east, a thundering avalanche of horsemen. The disparity in technology was something the warriors acknowledged but did not fear. They had faced the guns of the soldiers before. They knew the sound of the volley, the whistle of the mini-ball, and the long silence that followed while the soldiers fumbled with their ramrods. It was in that silence that the warrior lived. It was in that silence that he rode in, sliding off the side of his pony to use the animal's body as a shield, loosing arrow after arrow under the horse's neck. They underestimated the firepower behind the logs, not because they were foolish, but because their entire experience of warfare against the army had taught them that the rifle was a slow, clumsy weapon. By the evening of July 31st, the force was in position. They lay hidden in the folds of the earth, 1,000 men breathing quietly in the darkness. The smell of sage and dust was heavy in the air. The horses were hobbled or held by the reins, kept quiet by the soothing hands of their riders. The valley below was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the soldiers' campfires. The warriors could hear the distant sounds of the camp, a laugh, the clanking of a pot, the braying of a mule. It fueled their anticipation. The enemy was right there, sleeping, ignorant of the doom hanging over them. The leaders, Ice of the Cheyenne and the Sioux headmen, met one last time in the darkness. They confirmed the signals. The attack would begin after the soldiers had split their force, sending the mowing machines out into the field. This would divide the defenders, leaving some in the open and some in the corral. It was a classic tactic: divide and conquer. The warriors would sweep up the workers in the field first, cutting them down before they could reach the safety of the logs, and then turn the full weight of their numbers on the corral itself. The night was long for the waiting warriors. The temperature dropped, the high plains air cooling rapidly. Men wrapped themselves in buffalo robes, huddled together for warmth, waiting for the gray light of dawn. There was no talking, only the silent communion of men about to kill. They sharpened their knives and checked the strings of their bows. The anticipation was a physical ache. They were the tip of the spear for their people, the instrument of retribution for the invasion of their lands. They did not see themselves as attackers, but as defenders of a way of life that was being strangled by the forts and the wagon trains. The acoustic landscape of the pre-dawn hours was critical. The warriors listened for the bugle calls from the fort, the signal that the soldiers were waking. They listened for the jingle of harness chains as the teams were hitched to the wagons. Every sound from the valley below was a piece of intelligence, confirming the routine was unchanged. The soldiers were following their schedule, walking blindly into the maw of the ambush. The patience required to lie still while adrenaline flooded the system was immense, a discipline drilled into them from childhood hunts. As the first hint of light began to bleach the eastern sky, the tension reached its peak. The 1,000 warriors shifted, shedding their robes, mounting their ponies. The silence of the night was replaced by the soft thudding of hooves on dirt and the creaking of leather. They moved into their final assault positions, lining the ridges and filling the ravines. The trap was primed. The sheer weight of their numbers was a physical presence pressing against the valley. They were not just a fighting force. They were a tidal wave of history poised to crash down on the 25 men who thought their willow logs would save them. The confidence of the coalition was absolute. Today, the grass of the Bighorn Valley would be watered with the blood of the invaders. The first gray light of dawn on August 1st, 1867, filtered into the Bighorn Valley with a deceptive tranquility. The sky to the east over the Wolf Mountains bled from a deep indigo into a bruised purple, signaling the arrival of a sun that would soon bake the moisture out of the earth. Inside the log corral, the transition from sleep to wakefulness was a ragged, unceremonious affair. There was no bugle call here, only the rough shaking of shoulders and the low murmur of voices trying not to disturb the heavy silence of the plains. Lieutenant Sigismund Sternberg was among the first to rise. He rolled out of his blankets, his joints stiff from the hard ground, and immediately checked the perimeter. The sentries were standing their posts, silhouettes against the lightening sky, their postures slumping slightly with the fatigue of the graveyard shift. The air was cool, a fleeting comfort that would vanish within the hour, carrying the scent of damp sagebrush and the lingering smoke of the previous night's fire. The camp came alive with the sounds of men preparing for labor rather than war. The 19 soldiers of the 27th Infantry and the 6 civilian contractors moved with a practiced economy. They pulled on their boots, shaking them out first to dislodge any scorpions or spiders seeking warmth, and buttoned their heavy wool tunics. The grittiness of the environment was inescapable. Dust had settled on everything during the night, coating their skin, their hair, and their food. Breakfast was a functional, joyless consumption of calories. The cook had the fire going, heating a large kettle of coffee that was thick and bitter. The men dipped their hardtack into the black liquid to soften it, chewing mechanically while they stared into the middle distance. There was little conversation. The early hour and the accumulated exhaustion of weeks of haying made them taciturn. Sternberg moved among the men, his eyes scanning their equipment. He was a meticulous officer who believed that discipline was the only barrier between a soldier and death in this wilderness. He watched as the men retrieved their rifles from the stacks. The wooden stocks were scarred from use, and the metal barrels were dull with oil. He noted the way the men checked the breech mechanisms of the Springfield Model 1866 rifles. They flipped the trapdoors open, checked the chambers, and snapped them shut with a metallic click that punctuated the morning quiet. The civilians, men like Al Colvin and J.G. Hollister, were tending to their own arsenals. They fed the rimfire cartridges into the loading tubes of their Spencer carbines and Henry rifles, the brass gleaming in the firelight. These men did not wait for orders to inspect their weapons. For them, the rifle was a limb, an extension of their will to survive. The livestock demanded immediate attention. The mules and horses tethered at the picket line stamped and snorted, sensing the activity. The smell of the animals, a pungent mix of wet hair, ammonia, and leather, hung heavy in the confines of the corral. The teamsters moved among them with curry combs and harnesses. The leather collars were heavy and stiff, requiring strength to wrestle onto the necks of the mules. Chains clinked and wood groaned as the wagons were hitched up. The mules were stubborn, nipping at the men and resisting the bit, their behavior normal and reassuring in its predictability. This was the work they did every day. There was no sign from the animals that today would be different. no instinctual panic to warn their masters. By the time the sun crested the horizon, painting the valley in harsh gold light, the detachment was ready to deploy. The gates of the corral were swung open. The plan for the day was identical to the plan for the last several weeks. A portion of the force would remain at the corral to guard the camp and the stockpiled hay, while the rest would move out into the open field to operate the mowing machines and gather the cut grass. Sternberg designated the guard detail, leaving a handful of soldiers and civilians behind the willow walls. He mounted his horse, settling into the saddle with a grimace, and signaled for the work party to move out. The wagons rolled forward, their iron-rimmed wheels grinding into the dry soil, kicking up small puffs of dust that hung in the still air. The deployment of the pickets was the first critical tactical move of the morning. Sternberg knew that the hayfield was a bowl, commanded by the bluffs that rose to the east and south. To work blindly in the bottom was suicide. He ordered a small detail of soldiers to climb the heights. These men, carrying their rifles and canteens, trudged up the steep slopes, their boots slipping on the loose shale. Their job was to act as the eyes of the command. They reached their positions on the rim of the valley, settling into the rocks where they had clear lines of sight for miles. From their vantage point, the world dropped away. They could see the ribbon of the Bighorn River, the dark square of the corral, and the tiny figures of their comrades moving into the grass. They scanned the horizon, looking for the telltale dust of riders, but the landscape was empty. The vast emptiness of the territory was their only companion. Down in the valley, the work began in earnest. The mowing machines were engaged, the drivers cracking their whips over the heads of the horses. The reciprocating blades began to clatter, a rhythmic mechanical noise that sliced through the silence of the morning. The tall grass fell in waves before the iron teeth, laying down in neat swathes. The smell of cut vegetation rose instantly, a sweet, green aroma that clashed with the dry scent of the plains. Soldiers and civilians followed the machines with pitchforks, tossing the hay into windrows or loading it onto the wagons. It was backbreaking labor. The sun, now fully detached from the horizon, began to bear down with a vengeance. The temperature climbed steadily, promising a day of blistering heat. Al Colvin worked alongside the men, but his eyes were rarely on the ground. He was a man who had lived long enough in the West to trust his paranoia more than his eyesight. He kept his Henry rifle within arm's reach, propped against a wagon wheel or slung across his back. He watched the ravines that cut through the valley floor, deep scars in the earth that could hide 100 men. The grass near the river was particularly thick, tall enough to conceal a horseman. Colvin paused frequently to wipe the sweat from his brow, his gaze lingering on the shadows in the brush. He felt a tension that he could not articulate, a vibration in the air that felt wrong. The birds were singing, the river was rushing, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The geography of the hayfield created a sense of isolation even within the group. The workers were spread out over several 100 yards. The noise of the mowers created a sonic bubble, drowning out the softer sounds of the environment. A man shouting from the perimeter might not be heard over the clatter of the blades. Sternberg rode the line, keeping the men organized, ensuring they did not drift too far from the central cluster of wagons. He was acutely aware of the distance to the corral. If they were attacked here in the open, they would have to run a gauntlet to get back to the safety of the logs. He checked the position of the sun, calculating the hours until the midday break. The soldiers on the picket line stared into the glare. The sun was directly in their eyes when looking east, a tactical disadvantage that the warriors of the plains understood perfectly. The sentries squinted, shading their eyes with their hands, trying to pierce the shimmering heat haze that was already beginning to form. They saw the heat waves rising from the rocks, distorting the shapes of the distant ridges. A coyote trotted across a far slope, stopping to look back at them before vanishing into a coulee. A hawk circled overhead, hunting for field mice exposed by the mowers. These were the only movements in a landscape that seemed carved from stone. Back at the corral, the men remaining behind busied themselves with camp chores. They watered the reserve horses, repaired harness leather, and cleaned the cooking pots. The fortification felt empty with the main body of men out in the field. The willow walls, so comforting at night, seemed flimsy in the daylight. One of the soldiers climbed onto the roof of a crude shelter to get a better view of the field. He watched the wagons moving back and forth, the slow progress of the harvest. It was a scene of pastoral industry that felt completely out of place in the war zone. The juxtaposition of the agricultural machinery and the loaded rifles was a stark reminder of their reality. As the morning wore on, the heat became oppressive. The men in the field, stripped down to their undershirts, their suspenders hanging loose. Sweat soaked their hatbands and dripped into their eyes, stinging with salt. They drank tepid water from canteens that were hot to the touch. The dust kicked up by the work coated their throats, making them cough and spit. The physical discomfort became the primary focus of their existence. They cursed the heat, the flies that swarmed around the horses, and the monotony of the task. The fear of attack receded slightly, pushed back by the immediate misery of the labor. It was difficult to maintain a state of high alert when the body was screaming for rest and shade. The wind began to pick up, rustling the uncut grass and creating waves that rippled across the valley floor. The sound of the wind in the cottonwoods along the river was a rushing hiss, similar to the sound of running water. This auditory camouflage was dangerous. It masked the sound of hoofbeats and the rustle of bodies moving through the brush. The warriors, hidden in the deep ravines miles away, were using this wind and the distraction of the work to begin their final approach. They were moving now, leaving their holding positions and flowing like water into the approach channels that led to the hayfield. The wolves on the high ridges signaled the movement, flashes of mirrors that were lost in the general glare of the sun. Sternberg halted his horse near one of the mowers to speak with the driver. The conversation was brief, shouted over the noise of the machine. They discussed the quality of the grass and the quota for the day. The lieutenant's horse flicked its ears nervously, dancing sideways. Sternberg patted the animal's neck, attributing the behavior to the flies. He did not see the figure creeping through the sagebrush 500 yards away, a scout positioning himself to cut off the retreat. The net was tightening, but the strands were still invisible to the men inside it. The routine of the morning had a hypnotic quality. Load the wagon, drive it to the corral, unload, return to the field. The repetition dulled the senses. The men fell into a rhythm, their muscles performing the tasks without conscious thought. This trance was what the enemy counted on. They waited for the moment when the guard was lowest, when the separation between the workers and their weapons was greatest. At this moment, some of the men had left their rifles on the wagons while they pitched hay 10 yards away. It was a small distance, but in a sudden ambush, 10 yards was an eternity. By mid-morning, the sun was high and fierce. The shadows had shrunk to puddles beneath the wagons. The air shimmered violently. The pickets on the bluff shifted their weight, their legs cramping from standing still. They drank the last of their water, wishing for the relief column to come out and swap places with them. They scanned the horizon one more time, their eyes tearing from the brightness. To the north, a small cloud of dust appeared, but it was dismissed as a dust devil or a herd of antelope. It did not look like cavalry, and it did not look like a war party. It was just another feature of the hostile earth. Al Colvin stopped working. He stood perfectly still, leaning on his pitchfork, his head cocked to the side. The noise of the mowers was constant, but underneath it he thought he heard something else. A thrumming sound, felt in the soles of his feet as much as heard with his ears. It was the vibration of the earth. He looked at the other men, but they were oblivious, lost in their sweat and toil. Colvin dropped the pitchfork and walked to his horse, pulling his Henry rifle from the scabbard. He checked the action, sliding around into the chamber. Zeke Colvin, seeing his kinsman's reaction, did the same. The civilians, tuned to a different frequency than the soldiers, began to arm themselves. Sternberg noticed the change in the civilians. He wheeled his horse around. Riding over to Colvin, he asked no questions but loosened the flap of his holster. The lieutenant respected the instincts of the frontiersman. If Colvin was spooked, there was a reason. Sternberg signaled to the sergeant to tighten the perimeter of the workers. The soldiers, grumbling at the interruption, picked up their rifles. The mowers continued to clatter, the drivers unaware of the silent alarm spreading through the guard detail. The machine noise now seemed deafening, a liability that prevented them from hearing the approach of doom. The landscape suddenly felt very small. The bluffs seemed to loom over them, the ravines appeared deeper and darker. The illusion of the empty plains shattered. The men realized they were in a bowl, and the rim of the bowl was the only way out. The river at their backs was a barrier, not a refuge. The only safety was the log corral, which now looked miles away. The psychological shift from worker to warrior happened in seconds. The pitchforks were dropped, the rifles raised. Eyes scanned the brush line, looking for the target they knew was there. Then the birds stopped singing. The meadowlarks, which had been flitting across the grass all morning, vanished. The silence from the natural world was absolute, cutting through the mechanical noise of the mowers. It was the final warning. The pickets on the hill stood up, waving their arms frantically, their shouts lost in the distance. One of them fired a shot into the air, a tiny pop that was barely audible. But the smoke from the muzzle was visible. It drifted up, white against the blue sky, the signal that the routine morning was over. The men in the field froze. They looked at the smoke, then at the ridges. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The world held its breath. The sun beat down, the wind blew, the grass waved. It was a tableau of suspended animation. Then the horizon moved. The ridgeline, which had been bare rock a moment ago, sprouted a forest of feathers and lance tips. The earth began to tremble in earnest now, the thrumming growing into a roar. The trapdoor of reality swung open, revealing the nightmare underneath. Sternberg shouted the order to fall back. The drivers whipped the horses, turning the heavy machines around in tight circles. The wagons lurched into motion. Men scrambled onto the tailgates or ran alongside, clutching their rifles. The retreat to the corral began not as a panic, but as a desperate race against geometry. They had to close the distance to the logs before the wave crashing down from the hills swallowed them whole. The routine morning had ended. The time of the Hayfield Fight had arrived. The transition from the monotony of labor to the chaos of survival occurred by mid-morning on August 1st, 1867. The initial warning shot from the picket on the bluff was not merely a sound, it was the shearing of the thin veil that separated the soldiers from the violence of the frontier. The smoke from the sentry's rifle had barely begun to dissipate into the blue sky when the ridgeline to the east, previously a static horizon of rock and scrub, erupted with kinetic energy. The optical illusion of the empty plains dissolved instantly. What had appeared to be barren earth transformed into a solid wall of mounted warriors, a living landslide cresting the heights and beginning the terrifying descent toward the valley floor. The vibration that Al Colvin had felt in the soles of his boots amplified into a physical trembling of the ground, a seismic disturbance generated by thousands of hooves striking the hard-packed clay in unison. On the high ground, the pickets who had fired the warning were immediately engulfed in a desperate struggle for their own existence. They were isolated, separated from the main body of the detachment by hundreds of yards of steep, broken terrain. The wave of warriors did not slow down to engage them. It flowed over them and around them like floodwater around a stone. The soldiers on the hill fired their weapons, the reports of their rifles tiny and insignificant against the roar of the charge. They scrambled backward, boots sliding on loose shale, lungs burning as they abandoned their vantage points. Their mission to observe was over. Their only objective now was to reach the valley floor before they were ridden down or pinned by the flankers moving with terrifying speed through the coulees. Down in the hayfield, the reaction was a frantic dismantling of the work detail. Lieutenant Sigismund Sternberg, his horse dancing beneath him as the animal caught the scent of the approaching war ponies, shouted commands that cut through the sudden paralysis of the men. The drivers of the mowing machines perched on their iron seats realized with a jolt of terror that they were sitting on slow, cumbersome targets. There was no time to unhitch the teams with any delicacy. Men slashed at leather traces with knives or whipped the animals into a frenzy, forcing the heavy machines to turn in tight, jarring circles that threatened to tip them over. The clatter of the blades ceased, replaced by the frantic shouting of men and the screaming of horses subjected to the whip. The geography of the hayfield, which had seemed so open and peaceful moments before, now felt like a trap. The distance to the log corral, less than half a mile for some, stretched out into an agonizing gauntlet. The workers who had been farthest out, gathering the cut hay into windrows, were the most exposed. They abandoned their pitchforks and rakes, the tools falling into the stubble as meaningless artifacts of a previous life. They grabbed their rifles from the wagon beds and began to run. It was not a sprint for glory, but a heavy-footed, desperate jog in heavy boots, weighed down by ammunition belts and the crushing heat of the sun. They ran with their heads turning constantly, gauging the closing speed of the enemy against their own progress. The warriors coming off the bluffs were not a disorganized rabble. They moved with a terrifying fluidity, guided by the whistles of eagle-bone flutes and the hand signals of their society leaders. The main body swept down the slope, a cascade of color and motion. Feathers fluttered in the wind created by their own speed, and the sunlight glinted off lance tips and the barrels of trade muskets. They did not fire immediately. They held their fire, intent on closing the distance to point-blank range, to overrun the soldiers in the open before a defense could be organized. The sheer silence of their weapons in these first moments was more unnerving than gunfire. It signaled a discipline and a confidence that chilled the blood of the fleeing soldiers. Simultaneously, the trap snapped shut from the rear. The willows along War Man Creek, which had provided shade and a sense of security to the camp, exploded with movement. A second force of warriors, having crept through the willow thickets and along the riverbank, burst into the open. These were the flankers, positioned to cut off the retreat and catch the soldiers in a crossfire. The men running toward the corral saw the new threat emerge from the green wall of vegetation. The sanctuary of the logs was suddenly blocked by a screen of mounted enemies. The geometry of the battlefield shifted instantly. There was no safe direction, only a shrinking circle of ground that was not yet occupied by the coalition forces. The wagons became the focal point of the retreat. The teamsters lashed their mules, the heavy wagons bouncing violently over the ruts and tufts of sagebrush. Soldiers who could not run fast enough scrambled onto the tailgates or dove into the beds, leveling their rifles over the wooden sides. The wagons were life rafts in a sea of violence. If a wheel broke or a mule went down, the men aboard would be stranded in the open, overwhelmed in seconds. The noise was deafening. The creaking of wood, the rattling of chains, the shouting of men, and the thunder of the converging charge. Dust rose in choking clouds, obscuring vision and mixing with the sweat on the men's faces to form a gritty mask of panic. Al Colvin and the other civilians, mounted on their own horses, fought a rearguard action. They did not gallop blindly for the corral. Instead, they checked their mounts, turning to face the oncoming wave. They raised their repeating rifles, the Henrys and Spencers that they had cleaned so religiously. Colvin picked a target, a warrior riding a paint pony near the front of the charge, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. He worked the lever action, the brass cartridge case spinning out into the sunlight, and fired again. The rate of fire from the civilians was the only thing that slowed the initial rush. The warriors, expecting the slow cadence of muzzle loaders, were momentarily checked by the rapid stinging of the repeaters. A horse went down, tumbling in a cloud of dust, throwing its rider. The charge split around the fallen obstacle, but the momentary hesitation bought the wagons a few precious seconds. Lieutenant Sternberg rode back and forth across the rear of the retreating column, exposing himself to draw fire and direct the movement. He shouted at the stragglers, urging them on, his saber drawn not for combat but to point the way. He saw the pincer movement closing. The warriors from the hills and the warriors from the river were converging on the corral like the jaws of a vice. He knew that if they did not reach the logs before the two jaws met, the detachment would be cut in half. The infantrymen, their chests heaving, ran with the desperation of men who could feel the breath of the enemy on their necks. They did not fire back. To stop and load would be to die. They simply ran, clutching their rifles, their eyes fixed on the willow walls of the corral. The first arrows began to fall among the retreating soldiers. They dropped out of the sky with a hiss, striking the ground with a thud or burying themselves in the wood of the wagons. There was no sound of a bowstring, only the arrival of the missile. A mule squealed and kicked out as an arrow grazed its flank, nearly overturning a wagon. The driver fought the reins, cursing and praying in the same breath. The air began to fill with the buzzing sound of gunfire as the warriors with muskets opened up. The balls kicked up spouts of dirt around the running men, whistling past ears and ricocheting off the iron rims of the wagon wheels. The sensory overload was total. There was too much to see, too much to hear, and nowhere to hide. The entrance to the corral was a bottleneck. The heavy wagons thundered through the gap in the willow walls, the hubs scraping the posts. Men dove through the opening, rolling in the dirt and scrambling to their feet to turn and defend the entrance. The soldiers who had remained in the camp during the morning were already at the walls, their rifles thrust through the loopholes. They held their fire, waiting for their comrades to clear the field of fire. The tension inside the corral was excruciating. Every man inside wanted to shoot, to push back the wall of enemies, but they could not fire without risking hitting their own men who were sprinting the last 50 yards. As the last wagon rumbled inside, the teamsters jumped down and began to unhitch the mules, slapping them toward the picket line. The animals were in a panic, their eyes rolling, smelling the fear of the men and the scent of the strange horses closing in. The interior of the corral was a scene of controlled mayhem. Men were shouting for ammunition, checking their weapons, and throwing themselves against the willow walls. Sternberg was the last to enter. He galloped through the gate, his horse foaming, and immediately dismounted. He shouted for the entrance to be sealed. The closing of the corral was a physical struggle. There was no heavy iron gate. Instead, the men used a heavy wagon, pushing it manually into the gap between the upright logs. They locked the wheels with chains and piled bags of grain and boxes of hardtack against the wheels to create a barricade. It was a flimsy plug for the hole, but it was all they had. Other men threw logs and brush into the remaining gaps, frantically building up the barrier. They were sealing themselves in, turning the corral from a workspace into a coffin or a fortress, depending on how the next hour played out. Outside, the two wings of the warrior force met. The men from the hills and the men from the river merged into a swirling mass of horsemen that completely encircled the fortification. They pulled up their ponies just out of effective range of the muzzle loaders, shouting insults and war cries. The sheer number of them was staggering. To the defenders peering through the gaps in the willow wickerwork, the horizon seemed to be made of men. There were hundreds of them, 500, perhaps 800. The scale of the attack was far beyond anything the 25 defenders had anticipated. This was not a raiding party. It was an army. The dust cloud raised by the charge settled slowly, coating the defenders in a fine gray powder. Inside the corral, the noise of the charge was replaced by the heavy, ragged breathing of the men. They slumped against the walls, wiping sweat from their eyes, their hands shaking as they fumbled for cartridges. The realization of their situation settled over them like a heavy blanket. They were trapped. The fort was 2.5 miles away, invisible behind the terrain. They had limited water, limited ammunition, and they were outnumbered at least 20-1. The routine morning was a distant memory. The reality now was the sun, the logs, and the enemy. The warriors began to test the perimeter immediately. Small groups rode in close, hanging off the sides of their horses, firing under the necks of the animals. They were probing for weaknesses, looking for an angle where the walls were low or the defenders were thin. Arrows arced high over the walls, plunging down into the center of the corral. The mules at the picket line began to scream as they were hit. The defenders had to detach men to calm the animals or put them down if they became too dangerous. The screams of the wounded livestock added a visceral layer of horror to the siege. Sternberg moved along the line, checking his men. He was calm, his voice steady as he assigned sectors of fire. He placed the civilians with their repeating rifles at the corners and the gate, the most vulnerable points. He placed the soldiers with their trapdoor Springfields along the long walls. He reminded them to conserve ammunition, to pick their targets, to make every shot count. He knew that if they panicked and fired wildly, they would be overrun in minutes. The discipline of the 27th Infantry was the mortar holding the willow logs together. The heat inside the corral began to rise. The walls blocked the breeze, and the bodies of the men and animals generated a stifling humidity. The sun, now approaching its zenith, beat down into the enclosure without mercy. There was no shade except under the wagons and the crude bowers, which were now being torn apart to reinforce the walls. The water in the barrels was warm and tasted of wood. The men took swigs from their canteens, rationing the liquid, knowing it might be a long time before they could reach the river again. The initial shock of the assault began to fade, replaced by a grim determination. The men looked at each other, seeing the fear but also the resolve in the eyes of their comrades. They were a mix of immigrants, veterans, and frontiersmen bound together by the logs and the dirt. They checked the sights of their rifles. They laid out their cartridges in neat rows on the ground or on the logs in front of them. They waited for the main assault, watching the warriors massing for a coordinated charge. The view through the loopholes was terrifying. The warriors were dismounting now, leaving their ponies with holders in the ravines. They were preparing to advance on foot, utilizing the tall grass and the dips in the ground to crawl closer. The defenders could see the feathers rising above the grass, the glint of metal moving through the sagebrush. The enemy was adapting, shifting from a cavalry charge to an infantry assault. They were going to use their numbers to swarm the walls, to overwhelm the defenders with a tide of bodies. Al Colvin stood at the barricaded gate, his Henry rifle resting on a sack of grain. He watched a group of warriors, gathering near a clump of cottonwoods 300 yards away. He adjusted the rear sight of his rifle, calculating the drop. He was not a soldier. He was a survivor. He knew that the only way to stop them was to make the price of the approach too high. He whispered a curse under his breath, wiped his trigger finger on his trousers, and settled his cheek against the walnut stalk. The pickets who had been on the hill, the ones who had not been cut down in the first rush, came tumbling over the rear wall of the corral. They were breathless, their uniforms torn, their faces scratched by the brush. They collapsed inside the perimeter, gasping out reports of the numbers they had seen. "Thousands," one wheezed. "The whole nation is out there." Their arrival brought no comfort, only confirmation of the odds. The perimeter had collapsed back to this tiny square of earth. There was nowhere left to run. Sternberg looked at his watch. It was 11 o'clock. The fight had been going on for less than 30 minutes. But the world had changed completely. The silence of the morning was gone, replaced by the intermittent crack of sniper fire and the chanting of the warriors. The sun was a white disk in the sky, indifferent to the struggle below. The lieutenant snapped the cover of his watch shut and drew his revolver. He looked at his sergeant. "Check the ammunition," he ordered, "and tell the men to stay low. Here they come." Beyond the walls, the chanting grew louder. The warriors were working themselves up for the push. The sound was rhythmic, a deep, guttural pulse that seemed to synchronize with the beating of the defenders' hearts. Then, with a collective shout that rang off the bluffs, the grass around the corral came alive. The second phase of the battle was about to begin. The race was over. The siege had commenced. The willow logs, cut from the riverbank and packed with the soil of the valley, were about to be tested against the fury of 1,000 men who believed their victory was inevitable. It was late morning on August 1st, 1867, when the tactical assumptions of a decade of plains warfare were violently dismantled. The sun hung high in the sky, a blinding white disk that cast almost no shadows, exposing the valley floor to a merciless glare. Inside the willow log corral, the heat was intensifying, trapped by the bodies of the men and the animals, mixing with the sharp scent of ozone and nervousness. Lieutenant Sigismund Sternberg crouched behind the wickerwork wall, his eyes fixed on the movement in the tall grass beyond the cleared perimeter. He watched the feathers and the painted shields bobbing just above the vegetation, moving with the fluidity of a liquid tide. The warriors were massing for the first coordinated assault, a maneuver designed to overwhelm the small garrison through sheer weight of numbers. The strategy of the northern Cheyenne and the Lakota Sioux was rooted in the rhythm of the muzzle loader. For years they had fought soldiers, armed with muskets that required a complex multi-step process to reload. A soldier had to fire, lower the butt of the weapon to the ground, tear a paper cartridge with his teeth, pour the powder, ram the ball down the barrel, prime the cap, and raise the weapon again. This cycle took 20 to 30 seconds for even the most skilled infantryman. The warriors knew this interval intimately. It was the dead time, a window of vulnerability where the soldier was defenseless. The plan was simple: provoke the volley, wait for the smoke to bloom, and then sprint through the silence to strike before the ramrods could finish their work. Hundreds of warriors began to rise from the cover of the ravines and the sagebrush. They stood in a long, ragged line that curved around the eastern and southern faces of the corral. They were stripped for battle, their chests bare and painted, their weapons held high. The chanting that had built up during the approach stopped, replaced by a sudden, terrifying silence. Then, with a single piercing cry from a war chief, the line surged forward. It was not a tentative probe, it was a full-throated charge. They ran with high steps to clear the brush, their moccasins thudding against the hard earth, closing the distance with terrifying speed. They intended to take the walls in a single rush, accepting the casualties of the first volley as the price of victory. Inside the corral, the soldiers of the 27th Infantry rested the heavy octagonal barrels of their rifles on the logs. These were not the muzzle loaders of the past. They were the Springfield Model 1866, the trapdoor conversions that had only recently arrived on the frontier. The external appearance of the gun was similar to the old musket, but the mechanism at the breech was a radical departure. A hinged block, the trapdoor, could be flipped up to reveal the chamber. The ammunition was not paper and loose powder, but a self-contained metallic cartridge, the 50-70 government round. It was a copper case holding 70 grains of black powder and a massive 450-grain slug. Sternberg waited, his saber in hand, watching the range close. 300 yards. 200. The warriors were screaming now, a wall of sound that vibrated the air. 100 yards. The faces of the individual attackers became distinct. The war paint, the grimaces of exertion, the eyes fixed on the gaps in the logs. Fire! Sternberg's command was a guttural bark that released the tension. The volley ripped out from the corral, a sheet of flame and white smoke that obscured the view for a heartbeat. The heavy .50 caliber slugs slammed into the front rank of the charge, punching through shields and bodies with kinetic force that lifted men off their feet. In the old way of war, this would have been the moment for the warriors to accelerate. The smoke would hang there and the soldiers would be fumbling for their ramrods. The attackers expected the lull. They expected the soldiers to stand up or kneel to reload, exposing themselves. But the lull never came. Inside the corral, there was no panic, no frantic tearing of paper. The soldiers simply reached for the thumb latch on the breech. Click. The trapdoor flew open. The extractor claw pulled the empty copper casing from the chamber, ejecting it with a metallic ping. Clack. A fresh cartridge was shoved into the breech. Snap. The door was closed. The hammer was pulled back. The entire process took less than 5 seconds. Before the smoke of the first volley had even begun to drift on the breeze, the second volley hammered into the charging mass. The warriors, who had accelerated to exploit the expected gap in fire, ran headlong into a second wall of metal. The shock was absolute. Men who had been sprinting with the confidence of inevitable victory crumpled in mid-stride. The front rank dissolved, tripping over the fallen, their momentum checked by the sheer density of the incoming fire. The continuous roar of the rifles was a sound they had never heard from infantry before. It was not a staccato rhythm of shoot and load, it was a rolling drumbeat of destruction. The civilians at the corners of the corral added a different pitch to the cacophony. Al Colvin and Zeke Colvin stood with their Henry and Spencer repeaters, working the lever actions with a blur of motion. The Henry rifles held 16 rounds in a tubular magazine. The civilians did not fire in volleys, they fired at will, sweeping the flanks of the charge. The smaller caliber bullets of the repeaters buzzed like angry hornets, stitching lines of dust across the ground and dropping warriors who tried to circle the logs. The volume of fire from these few men was equivalent to a platoon of musketeers. The brass casings from their rifles piled up around their boots, glistening in the sun. The psychological impact on the coalition forces was devastating. The warriors were charging into a meat grinder. The logic of their tactics had evaporated. There was no safe interval. There was no time to close the distance. The closer they got to the walls, the more intense the fire became. The soldiers were firing prone or kneeling behind cover, offering almost no target in return. The warriors saw only the muzzle flashes and the tops of the slouch hats. They fired back with bows and trade muskets, but their return fire was ragged and ineffective against the solid defense of the logs and earth. The charge faltered at 40 yards. The momentum broke against the physics of the new weaponry. The warriors in the front, realizing that the fire was not stopping, threw themselves into the grass seeking the cover of the earth. The ones behind them skidded to a halt, confused and horrified by the piles of bodies blocking their path. The chiefs, mounted on ponies in the rear, shouted for them to push on, but the command was lost in the din. The instinct for self-preservation overrode the desire for glory. The wave of humanity receded, not in a panic, but in a bewildered scramble for the safety of the ravines. Inside the corral, the soldiers did not stop. They continued to fire at the retreating figures, the trapdoor mechanisms working smoothly. The heat of the barrels began to radiate through the wood of the stocks, burning the hands of the men, but they ignored the pain. They were fueled by the adrenaline of survival. They saw the enemy running. They saw the unbeatable numbers breaking before their fire. A grim satisfaction settled over the line. They were not helpless victims in a trap. They were the masters of a new kind of slaughter. As the warriors pulled back to the safety of the ridge lines and the river bottom, The smoke began to lift, revealing the grim harvest of the charge. The ground in front of the corral was littered with the fallen. The bright colors of the war bonnets and the painted shields lay stark against the brown grass. The moans of the injured drifted across the open space, a haunting counterpoint to the ringing in the defenders' ears. The sheer number of casualties was staggering. In minutes, the coalition had lost more men than they typically lost in an entire season of raiding. Sternberg moved down the line, checking his men. He saw the piles of empty copper casings, the brass cigars that had saved their lives. He slapped men on the shoulder, his face smeared with powder residue. "Keep the breaches clean," he shouted. "Watch the extractors." He knew that the only weakness of the system was the potential for a casing to jam in the chamber as the gun heated up. The men used their knives or fingers to flick out stubborn shells, their movements jerky but efficient. They were learning the quirks of their weapons in real time, in the crucible of combat. The civilians were reloading their magazines, shoving the rimfire cartridges into the loading tubes. Al Colvin wiped his face with a rag, his eyes hard. He looked at the devastation in the field and then at his rifle. He understood the magnitude of what had just happened. The warriors had brought a Stone Age strategy to a fight against Industrial Age engineering. The mismatch was not in courage or numbers, but in the mechanical capacity to project violence. The repeating rifles and the breech loaders had compressed the time frame of the battle, delivering an hour's worth of death in a few minutes. Out on the ridges, the confusion among the tribes was palpable. The chiefs gathered, their horses stamping nervously. They pointed at the corral, gesturing wildly. They could not understand the medicine of the soldiers. How could they fire without stopping? How could so few men create such a storm of bullets? The rumor began to spread through the ranks that the soldiers had new magic, a gun that loaded itself or never ran empty. The confidence that had buoyed the great gathering of the morning began to fracture. The belief in their invulnerability, fostered by the sun dance and the ceremonies, was shaken by the cold reality of the ballistic trauma they had just witnessed. The heat of the day seemed to press down harder in the aftermath of the charge. The sun was at its zenith now, turning the corral into a furnace. The smell of the black powder smoke hung heavy in the air, a sulphurous stench that coated the throat. The men reached for their canteens, taking sparing sips of the warm water. Their thirst was a physical agony, exacerbated by the salt of the gunpowder and the sweat of fear. But they were alive. They looked at the willow logs, now pockmarked with arrows and musket balls, and realized that the frail structure was holding. The warriors did not leave. They regrouped, moving the wounded back to the rear. They began to snipe from long range, using the cover of the terrain to harass the defenders. But the character of the fight had changed. The mass charge, the tactic of the overwhelming wave, had been broken. They would not try it again in the same way. The respect for the fire coming from the logs forced them to change their approach. They would have to dig the soldiers out, burn them out, or starve them out. The swift victory they had envisioned was gone. Inside the perimeter, the soldiers took stock of their ammunition. They had fired hundreds of rounds in the brief engagement. The crates were pried open and fresh boxes were distributed. The metallic glint of the cartridges was the most beautiful thing the men had ever seen. Each cartridge represented a chance, a moment of life bought with 70 grains of powder. They arranged them carefully, blowing the dust off the rims. The discipline of the 27th Infantry held firm. They did not celebrate. They prepared. They knew the enemy was still there, thousands strong, and that the sun had a long way to go before it set. The impact of the trapdoor rifle extended beyond the physical damage. It altered the temporal reality of the fight. The soldiers no longer felt the crushing anxiety of the reload time. They felt a sense of agency. They could react instantly. If a head popped up in the grass, they could put a bullet near it immediately. This shift in morale was critical. The feeling of being passive victims waiting for the wave to crash was replaced by the active focus of marksmanship. They were fighting back, bite for bite, shot for shot. The defense of the corral also revealed the value of the civilians. The soldiers, bound by drill and volley fire, provided the heavy rhythmic baseline of the defense. The civilians, with their repeaters, provided the rapid improvisational melody. They moved to wherever the pressure was greatest, their lever-action rifles stitching up the holes in the defense. The soldiers looked at the rough-hewn frontiersmen with new respect. The distinction between enlisted man and contractor dissolved in the smoke. There were only defenders of the logs. Sternberg watched the bluffs. He saw the flash of mirrors again. The enemy was communicating, adapting. He knew they would try something else. He checked the position of the sun. It was just past noon. The first crisis had been weathered, but the day was far from over. The trapdoor rifles had bought them time, but time was a resource that was burning away as fast as the water in their canteens. The lieutenant wiped his saber on his trouser leg and resheathed it. He picked up a rifle from a wounded man and checked the breech. It was clean. He snapped it shut and took his place on the line. The field in front of the corral was quiet now, save for the wind rustling the grass and the occasional cry of a wounded horse. The bodies of the warriors lay as testament to the new era of warfare. They were the victims of a technological leap they could not have foreseen. The 50-70 slug had drawn a line in the dirt that courage alone could not cross. The Hayfield Fight had turned on the hinge of a breech block, a small piece of steel that changed the math of the frontier forever. The soldiers waited, their fingers resting on the trigger guards, watching the shimmering heat waves for the next sign of movement. The trapdoor revelation was complete. Now the war of attrition would begin. The sun reached its zenith at 12 o'clock high on August 1st, 1867, transforming the interior of the Hayfield corral from a defensive position into a kiln. The high altitude of the Montana Territory meant the atmosphere provided little shielding from the solar radiation, which struck the valley floor with a physical weight. Inside the willow log enclosure, the air was stagnant, trapped by the walls that were designed to stop arrows, but now served to block any cooling breeze coming off the river. The temperature climbed steadily, surpassing 100 degrees, baking the moisture out of the earth and the men indiscriminately. The soldiers of the 27th Infantry, buttoned into their heavy blue wool uniforms, sat in pools of their own perspiration. The fabric chafed their skin, raw and red, while the leather of their belts and accoutrements grew slick and dark with sweat. The tactical situation had shifted from the kinetic frenzy of the mass charge to a grinding, static war of attrition. The warriors of the coalition, having learned the lethal lesson of the breech-loading rifles, had abandoned the open field. They were now ghosts in the terrain, utilizing the deep ravines, the tall grass, and the brush along the riverbank to encircle the position. They were no longer targets, they were sources of incoming fire. The sound of the battle had changed from a roar to a sporadic, rhythmic cracking of sniper fire. A puff of smoke would appear from a clump of sagebrush 300 yards away, followed instantly by the whistle of a musket ball passing overhead, or the dull thud of a projectile burying itself in the logs. The psychological strain of this phase was distinct from the adrenaline of the assault. During the charge, the threat was visible and the reaction was instinctual. Now the threat was invisible and constant. The men had to remain low, their faces pressed into the dirt or against the rough bark of the cottonwood logs. To raise, a head above the level of the wickerwork, was to invite immediate death. The enemy marksmen were patient. They had established crossfires that swept the interior of the corral, making movement dangerous. A soldier crawling from one position to another to borrow a canteen risked being struck by a plunging arrow or a bullet fired from the bluffs. The corral, which had felt like a fortress, now felt like a cage. Al Colvin moved among the men with a stubborn refusal to let the long-range fire pin them into paralysis. He was not a commissioned officer, but the day had already stripped rank down to a single requirement: keep the corral alive. He crouched low behind the log lattice and wagon wheels, checking cartridges, shifting shooters to new angles, and speaking in a voice made rough by heat and smoke. Dust clung to his sleeves, powder blackened his hands, and his eyes stayed fixed on the grass line where the coalition would gather itself for another rush. The soldiers, hunkered down in their shallow rifle pits, looked up at him with a mixture of gratitude and dread. They hissed warnings for him to stay low, to stop showing himself in the gaps. "Colvin, they have the range," a sergeant rasped, wiping grit from his eyes. Colvin ignored the panic and kept working the perimeter, calculating angles, watching the coulees and the willow line where shapes kept flickering in and out. Every minute he held the walls together was another minute bought for wounded men and for the barrels of water that were running low. The heat exacerbated the thirst that was becoming the primary enemy of the detachment. The water barrels were low, the liquid inside warm and tasting of the wood and the river silt. Men took tiny sips, holding the water in their mouths to moisten their cracked tongues before swallowing. The dehydration was setting in rapidly. Eyes were sunken, lips were split and bleeding, and headaches throbbed in time with the pulse. The nearby Warman Creek, flowing cool and fresh only a few dozen feet away, was a cruel taunt. They could hear the water moving over the rocks, a sound that seemed louder than the gunfire, driving the men to the edge of madness. To leave the corral to get water was suicide. To stay was to slowly wither. The flies arrived in legions, drawn by the scent of blood from the wounded horses and the sweat of the men. They swarmed the corral, landing on faces, hands, and the open breeches of the rifles. The constant buzzing added a layer of sensory torment to the heat and the fear. Men swatted at them futilely, their hands trembling with fatigue. The mules at the picket line, those that were still alive, stomped and threw their heads, tangled in their ropes, adding to the confusion and the dust that hung in the still air. During the first rush against the corral, the inevitable collision between Sternberg's philosophy of command and the reality of close-range fire came without warning. The lieutenant refused to fight on his belly. He drew his revolver and stood tall above the logs, trying to see and direct his men as the warriors swept in on both flanks, arrows and bullets hammering the willow work. A single shot cracked out of the surge, and the bullet struck him in the head. There was no time for a command, no final words. He went down hard in the dust, and the moment his body hit, the corral knew it had lost its only commissioned officer. The silence that followed the fall of the commander was heavy and terrified. The men nearest to him scrambled over, dragging his body into the shadow of a wagon, but it was immediately clear that he was gone. The shock rippled through the 19 soldiers of the infantry. Their officer, the symbol of authority and the link to the chain of command, was dead. For a moment, the discipline that held the willow walls together threatened to dissolve. The men looked at each other, their eyes wide and white in their blackened faces. The question hung in the hot air. Who gives the orders now? The vacuum of leadership lasted only seconds. It was filled not by a sergeant or a corporal, but by Al Colvin, the civilian contractor who had been fighting at the corner of the corral with his Henry rifle. Saw the lieutenant fall. He did not hesitate. Colvin was a man of the frontier, a veteran of the bleak realities of the West who understood that hesitation was the precursor to massacre. He racked the lever of his rifle, ejecting a spent brass casing, and walked into the center of the enclosure. He did not have shoulder straps or a commission, but he had the cold, hard gaze of a man who intended to survive. Colvin's assumption of command was not a democratic process. He did not ask for a vote. He simply began to issue instructions with a voice that cut through the panic. "Keep your heads down," he roared, his voice rough with smoke. "Don't bunch up. Spread out and watch the grass." He moved to the position Sternberg had occupied, but he did not stand tall. He crouched, moving with the economy of a predator. He looked at the soldiers, men who were technically his superiors in the hierarchy of the government, and they looked back at him and nodded. They saw in him a competence that transcended rank. He was a fighter, and right now, that was the only qualification that counted. The transition to civilian leadership changed the tactical approach of the defense. Sternberg had fought a defensive battle, reacting to the enemy and maintaining the integrity of the formation. Colvin fought an aggressive defense. He understood the psychology of the warrior. He knew that if the soldiers remained passive, the Sioux would grow bold and creep right up to the logs. Colvin ordered the men to fire at any movement, to suppress the snipers, to make the ground around the corral lethal. "If you see the grass move, put a bullet in it," he ordered. He used his own repeating rifle to demonstrate, sending a stream of 16 rounds into a clump of willows where a sniper was hiding. The rapid fire shredded the vegetation and silenced the incoming shots. The soldiers rallied around this new energy. The trapdoor Springfields began to speak again, their heavy booms punctuated by the sharper cracks of the civilian repeaters. The volume of fire increased, pushing the perimeter of the siege back a few precious yards. Colvin moved constantly, crawling on his hands and knees, checking the sectors. He grabbed a soldier by the shoulder. "Don't let your gun get too hot," he advised, his tone practical. "Pee on the barrel if you have to, but keep it shooting." He was solving problems with the pragmatism of a mechanic. The heat of the afternoon intensified, the sun moving slowly across the sky like a torture device. The thirst became a physical agony that superseded the fear of death. Men's tongues swelled in their mouths, making speech difficult. They communicated with hand signals and grunts. Colvin saw the deterioration. He knew he had to keep their minds occupied. He gave them tasks. "Count your rounds," he told them. "Clean the dust off your cartridges." He made them focus on the mechanics of their survival rather than the hopelessness of their situation. The warriors, sensing the disruption caused by the officer's death, attempted a localized rush on the southern wall. A group of 20 men burst from the cover of a ravine, hoping to catch the defenders in disarray. They sprinted across the open ground, their shields raised. Under Sternberg, the soldiers might have waited for a volley command. Under Colvin, they reacted individually. The man nearest the breach fired, then the next. Colvin himself spun around, his Henry rifle leveled. He fired 3 shots in rapid succession, dropping the leader of the rush. The attack withered under the independent, disciplined fire of the line. The warriors broke and ran back to cover, leaving 3 more bodies on the baked clay. This small victory solidified Colvin's authority. The soldiers realized that the civilian knew how to fight this war. They stopped looking at the body of the lieutenant and started looking at the man in the dusty buckskins. The hierarchy of the army had been replaced by the meritocracy of the Hayfield. The sergeant, a veteran of the Civil War, deferred to Colvin without a word, relaying his orders down the line. The integration of the civilians and the military was now complete. They were a single organism fighting for the same breath of air. Inside the corral, the conditions continued to degrade. The smell of the dead horses was becoming overpowering in the heat. The blood baked into the ground, attracting more flies. A few men had been wounded by the sniper fire, their groans low and constant. There was no surgeon, no morphine. They lay in the shade of the wagons, tended to by their comrades who offered them warm water and grim platitudes. Colvin checked on them, his face impassive. He knew there was nothing he could do for them, except win the fight. If the corral fell, the wounded would be the first to die. The sun began to slide past the vertical, casting long, distorted shadows inside the enclosure. The shift in light offered no relief from the temperature, but it changed the visibility. The glare that had blinded the defenders facing east now shifted, blinding the warriors facing west. Colvin noted this immediately. He shifted men to the western wall, anticipating that the enemy would use the sun to mask an approach from that direction. He was reading the battlefield like a chessboard, anticipating moves before they happened. The supply of ammunition was holding, but it was not infinite. Colvin ordered a redistribution. Men with full pouches crawled over to men who were down to their last few rounds. They passed the copper cartridges hand to hand, a currency more valuable than gold. The civilians shared their rimfire ammunition with each other, ensuring that the repeating rifles, the backbone of their rapid-fire capability, remained fed. This logistical shuffling kept the men busy and reinforced the communal nature of the defense. As the afternoon wore on, the thirst began to affect the men's vision. The horizon shimmered and danced. The distant bluffs seemed to move. Some men began to hallucinate, seeing water where there was only dust. Colvin walked the line, shaking men who were drifting into stupor. "Stay with me," he growled. "Look at the front sight, look at the grass." He forced them to focus on the immediate reality, anchoring them to the logs and the triggers. He was the willpower of the detachment, lending his strength to those whose reserves were empty. The death of Sternberg had been a tragedy, but in the brutal calculus of the fight, it had also been a catalyst. It stripped away the formalities of the military engagement and revealed the raw struggle for survival underneath. The men were no longer fighting for the flag or the fort. They were fighting for Colvin, for each other, and for the right to see the sun go down. The lieutenant's body lay covered by a blanket, a silent reminder of the price of the day. At 2 o'clock, a lull settled over the field. The shooting tapered off, the warriors withdrawing slightly to escape the heat and reassess their strategy. The silence was heavy and oppressive. It was not a peace. It was a holding of breath. Colvin used the time to check the barricade at the gate. He tested the chains on the wagon wheels, kicked the sandbags to ensure they were solid. He looked out through a gap in the logs at the bodies of the warriors lying in the sun. They were motionless, part of the landscape now. The isolation of the hayfield was absolute. There was no sign of relief from the fort, no bugle calls, no dust column on the road. They were alone in the center of a hostile nation. Colvin knew that the hardest part of the fight was yet to come. The warriors would try to burn them out. They would use fire to do what bullets could not. He looked at the dry grass inside the corral, at the hay scattered near the wagons. It was tinder waiting for a spark. He ordered men to start clearing the loose hay away from the walls, scraping the ground down to the bare dirt. It was desperate work in the heat, but it was necessary. The water barrel was tilted to get the last dregs. A cup was passed around, each man getting a mere wetness on his lips. It was not enough to hydrate, but it was a ritual of sharing. Colvin took his turn, the warm liquid doing little to cut the dust in his throat. He looked at the faces around him, gaunt, blackened, eyes bright with fever and fear. They were holding. The willow logs were holding. The trapdoor rifles were holding. And for now, the command was holding. The shadow of the western bluff began to creep toward the valley floor, promising a future relief from the direct sun. But with the shadows would come the warriors, using the darkness to close the distance. Colvin checked his Henry rifle again, sliding the brass follower down the tube. He had 16 shots, he had 19 men, he had a wall of sticks and dirt. It would have to be enough. The death of the command had been the beginning of the real fight, the fight where rank meant nothing and the only rank was survivor. The afternoon stretched out before them, a vast, hot expanse of time that had to be crossed 1 minute at a time. The early afternoon of August 1st, 1867, brought a claustrophobic shift to the battlefield that terrified the defenders more than the open charge had. By 1:30, the sun had moved just enough to cast the interior of the ravines into partial shadow, while the hayfield itself remained a brightly lit stage for the violence. The warriors of the coalition, realizing that the massed assault against breech-loading rifles was a mathematical impossibility, adapted their tactics with the fluidity of water finding a crack in a stone. They abandoned the ridgelines and the open ground, dropping down into the vegetation that gave the valley its name. The tall grass, which had been the object of the soldiers' labor only hours before, now became the primary weapon of the enemy. It stood waist-high in the open and chest-high near the river, a golden and green sea that could swallow 1,000 men and show nothing but a ripple in the wind. The soldiers of the 27th Infantry pressed their faces against the rough bark of the willow logs, staring into the dense growth. The visibility that had allowed them to dominate the field at 300 yards was gone. The war had shrunk. The effective range of engagement dropped from hundreds of yards to less than 20. The enemy was no longer a distinct figure on a horse. He was a rustle, a snap of a dry stalk, a shadow moving against the grain of the wind. The psychological pressure of this invisibility was immense. A man could strain his eyes until they watered, looking for the shape of a human, and see nothing until a puff of smoke erupted from the grass 10 yards away, and a bullet slapped into the wood next to his ear. Al Colvin, now the de facto commander of the defense, understood the danger of this new phase immediately. He moved along the perimeter, crouching low, his boots dragging in the dust. He spoke in a low, harsh whisper, instructing the men on how to read the vegetation. "Don't look for the man," he hissed. "Look for the grass moving against the wind. Look for the birds flying up." He was teaching them the visual language of the hunter, forcing them to unlearn the drill field habits of looking for lines of troops. The soldiers, their nerves frayed to the breaking point, nodded and narrowed their eyes. They watched the swaying stalks with a paranoid intensity, their fingers white on the trigger guards of their trapdoor Springfields. The warriors used the terrain features with masterful skill. To the north and south of the corral, the ground undulated with shallow depressions and dry washouts that led almost up to the walls. They crawled on their bellies through these low spots, pushing their shields ahead of them. They moved with the patience of predators, inching forward only when the wind gusted to mask the sound of their movement. They tied clumps of grass to their heads and backs, blending perfectly with the environment. A warrior could be lying 15 feet from the wall, completely invisible, waiting for a soldier to expose himself above the logs. The proximity was intimate. The defenders could hear the warriors calling to each other in low voices, the guttural sounds of the Lakota and Cheyenne languages drifting clearly over the barricade. At 2 o'clock, the nature of the incoming fire changed. The warriors, unable to see over the logs from their prone positions in the grass, began to employ indirect fire. They rolled onto their backs, bracing their heavy ash bows against their feet or the ground, and loosed arrows in high, arching trajectories. The shafts rose hundreds of feet into the blue sky, stalled at the apex, and then plunged straight down into the corral. It was a vertical bombardment against which the walls offered no protection. The arrows fell with a terrifying hiss, striking the hard-packed clay of the interior with a wet thud. They stuck quivering in the ground, in the sides of the wagons and in the bodies of the dead, horses. The defenders were forced to scramble for overhead cover. Men dove under the wagons, curling into balls between the wheels. Others pulled the canvas tarps over themselves, a flimsy shield that offered only psychological comfort. The soldiers at the walls had to remain at their posts, exposed to the falling missiles. They hunched their shoulders, pulling their slouch hats down, praying that the geometry of the shot would spare them. One soldier cried out as an arrow struck his calf, pinning his trouser leg to the earth. His comrades pulled the shaft free with a grunt of exertion, the man biting on his leather glove to stifle the scream. The arrow storm turned the interior of the corral into a kill zone, forcing the men to fight with one eye on the enemy and one eye on the sky. The heat in the tall grass was even more intense than inside the corral. The vegetation trapped the solar radiation, creating a humid, stifling microclimate for the crawling warriors. Yet they persisted, driven by a desire to counting coup on the men who had killed their brothers in the morning charge. They crept closer, pushing the envelope of survival. Some managed to get within 5 yards of the logs. They would pop up suddenly, fire a quick snapshot with a revolver or a trade musket, and drop back down before the return fire could locate them. These point-blank exchanges were deafening. The boom of the rifles and the muskets at such close range created a concussive overpressure that hammered the eardrums of the combatants. Colvin realized that the passive defense would see them overrun by inches. He ordered the civilians with the repeating rifles to conduct reconnaissance by fire. He directed them to sweep the grass at the base of the walls. "Sweep it low," he ordered. "Cut the grass." The civilians unleashed a barrage of rimfire cartridges, aiming not at specific targets, but at the suspected hiding spots. The heavy bullets chewed through the stalks, kicking up dirt and debris. Screams from the grass indicated hits. The sudden eruption of violence from the logs forced the creepers to pull back, widening the perimeter of safety by a few yards. It was a constant contest for space, fought with volume of fire rather than precision. The thirst of the defenders had moved past discomfort into the realm of physiological crisis. The adrenaline of the close-quarters fighting burned through their remaining hydration. Mouths were so dry that men could not spit. Their tongues felt like foreign objects, swollen and clumsy. The heat hallucinations worsened. A soldier staring into the grass saw water rippling instead of vegetation. He stood up, entranced, reaching for his canteen. A sergeant grabbed him by the belt and yanked him down just as a bullet buzzed through the space his head had occupied. "There is no water," the sergeant growled, his own voice a croak. "Only dust." The warriors began to taunt the defenders. This was a standard part of plains warfare, a way to test the spirit of the enemy. They spoke in broken English or used sign language that could be seen through the gaps in the logs. They called the soldiers women. They described in graphic detail what they would do when they came over the walls. They asked for water, mocking the soldiers' thirst. The sounds of these human voices, so close and so conversational, added a surreal layer to the violence. It was not a faceless war, it was a personal argument settled with ballistics. The soldiers, hardened veterans, hurled insults back. They cursed the warriors, their mothers, and their horses. The exchange of profanity became as heated as the exchange of gunfire. At 2:45, a warrior attempted a singular feat of bravery. He crawled through a shallow drainage ditch that ran perpendicular to the west wall, shielding him from view. He reached the base of the logs undetected. With a sudden, explosive movement, he sprang up, trying to thrust a burning bundle of sagebrush into the wickerwork of the wall. He intended to set the fort on fire from the outside. A soldier, seeing the sudden motion through a loophole, reacted instantly. He did not have time to aim. He simply thrust the muzzle of his trapdoor Springfield through the gap, effectively placing it against the warrior's chest, and pulled the trigger. The heavy 50-70 slug threw the man backward as if he had been kicked by a mule. The burning sage fell harmlessly into the dirt. The closeness of the kill shook the soldier. He sat back against the logs, his hands trembling, staring at the wisp of smoke curling from his barrel. Colvin used this incident to tighten the discipline. "They are trying to burn us," he warned. "Watch the base of the walls." He knew that fire was the ultimate weapon against their position. The willow logs were dry, the wickerwork was brittle, and the interior was filled with hay and canvas. If a fire took hold, they would be forced out into the open to be slaughtered. organized a detail to clear away any flammable material from the immediate interior of the walls, moving the hay wagons further into the center. The men worked with a frantic energy, scraping the ground bare with shovels in their bare hands. The ammunition supply for the repeating rifles began to concern the civilians. They had fired hundreds of rounds, suppressing the grass. Zeke Colvin and the others began to count their remaining cartridges. They slowed their rate of fire, picking their shots with more care. This reduction in volume emboldened the warriors. They sensed the hesitation. The rustling in the grass grew louder as more men moved into the forward positions. The pressure on the perimeter increased. The defenders felt the weight of the numbers pressing against them, a physical mass of hostility held back only by the thin line of willow and the reputation of their marksmanship. The flies were now a plague. They covered the dead warrior who lay just outside the wall. They swarmed the eyes and mouths of the living. The soldiers had to stop shooting to wipe the insects from their faces. The buzzing of the flies mixed with the buzzing of the bullets. It was a degradation of the human condition. The men felt filthy, reduced to animals trapped in a pen. The romanticism of the frontier had been stripped away, leaving only the biological imperatives of survival. At 3 o'clock, the wind shifted. A breeze sprang up from the northwest, bending the tall grass and creating a wave-like motion across the valley floor. This made the visual detection of the warriors even harder. The movement of the wind masked the movement of the men. Colvin cursed the weather. He knew the wind would also aid any fire the enemy managed to set. He watched the sky, looking for clouds, for any sign of a summer storm that might bring rain. But the sky remained a relentless, hard blue. The sun began its descent into the late afternoon, casting longer shadows that stretched out from the riverbank, providing fingers of darkness for the enemy to utilize. A sniper positioned in a high tree along the riverbank began to drop fire into the corral. He had found an angle that allowed him to see over the rear wall. His bullets struck the ground near the picket line, kicking up geysers of dust. One round struck a water barrel, punching a hole near the bottom. The precious liquid began to jet out into the dust. A soldier saw it and threw himself across the open ground, jamming his thumb into the hole to stop the leak. He lay there, pinned down by the sniper, saving the water with his body. His comrades returned fire at the tree, filling the branches with heavy slugs until the sniper fell, crashing through the foliage to the ground below. The relationship between the soldiers and the civilians solidified in this phase. They were no longer two separate entities. They shared the same loopholes, the same shade, and the same terror. A soldier would spot a target and point it out to a civilian with a repeater. "There, by the white rock," he would whisper. The civilian would nod and take the shot. They functioned as spotter-shooter teams, maximizing the efficiency of their limited resources. This cooperation was the glue holding the defense together. The sound of the river was a constant torment. It was so close. The men could imagine the cool water flowing over their skin. Some of the younger soldiers began to weep silently, the tears cutting tracks through the grime on their faces. It was not cowardice. It was the physiological breaking point. Colvin saw this and moved to them. He did not yell. He offered them a piece of hardtack or a reassuring hand on the shoulder. "Not much longer," he lied. "The sun is going down. They won't fight in the dark." He gave them a future to look toward, however uncertain it was. The warriors in the grass were also suffering. They lay in the baking heat without water, bleeding from wounds inflicted by the heavy-caliber rifles, but their resolve was hardened by the losses they had taken. They could not leave now. To retreat would be to admit that the medicine of the white men was stronger. They stayed in the vegetation, inching forward, looking for the one mistake that would end the stalemate. They shot arrows at the horses, trying to cause a stampede inside the corral that would break the walls. The poor animals, stung by arrows and maddened by thirst, kicked and reared, threatening to pull down the picket line. The defenders had to dodge the hooves of their own mounts while fighting the enemy. As the hour turned, the intensity of the close-quarters fight reached a plateau. Both sides were exhausted. The rapid movement slowed. The shooting became more sporadic but more accurate. It was a sniper's duel fought at the distance of a handshake. The soldiers learned to hold their fire until they saw a face or a torso. They stopped shooting at shadows. The efficiency of the defense improved as the desperation grew. They were becoming efficient killers, stripped of all extraneous thought. The grass around the corral was now trampled and matted in places, stained with blood and littered with brass casings and arrows. It looked like a field that had been worked by a reaper of death. The beauty of the valley had been erased. The environment itself seemed hostile, an accomplice to the siege. The mountains to the west, purple and majestic, looked down with indifference. Colvin returned to the center of the corral. He checked his Henry rifle. The mechanism was gritty with dust, but it still cycled. He looked at the sun. It was lower now. The angle of the light was changing. He knew the next phase was coming. The enemy had tried the charge. They had tried the creep. They had tried the arrows. There was only one card left for them to play, and the wind was blowing the right way for it. He looked at the dry grass stretching away from the walls and felt a cold knot in his stomach that had nothing to do with the heat. The war in the tall grass was ending, and the war of fire was about to begin. In the late afternoon on August 1st, 1867, when the battlefield transformed from a contest of ballistics into a struggle against the elements themselves, the sun, having passed its peak, hung heavily in the western sky, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched from the riverbank toward the beleaguered corral. The heat of the day had not broken. Instead, it had accumulated, baking the clay soil until it radiated warmth like the stones of a hearth. Inside the willow log enclosure, the air was thick and still, heavy with the metallic tang of spent gunpowder and the copper scent of blood. The defenders of the 27th Infantry and the civilian contractors lay against the logs, their bodies pushed beyond the limits of exhaustion. They were parched, their canteens long empty, their lips cracked and bleeding from the aridity. The firing had tapered off into a sullen standoff, with only the occasional snap of a sniper's rifle to remind them that the enemy was still watching, still waiting in the tall grass that surrounded them. Al Colvin wiped the grime from the receiver of his Henry rifle with a piece of torn shirt. He watched the grass to the south, his eyes narrowing against the glare. The wind had been fitful all day, stirring the dust in erratic swirls, but now it began to settle into a steady breeze blowing from the south, pushing directly against the southern wall of the corral. The significance of this meteorological shift was not lost on the warriors hidden in the vegetation. They had been unable to breach the walls with their bodies or their arrows. The trapdoor rifles and the repeating carbines had created a zone of death that no warrior could cross and live. But where men failed, nature could be coerced to succeed. The grass, dried to a golden crisp by the summer sun, was a weapon waiting to be ignited. The first sign of the new threat was not a sound, but a smell. A faint, acrid odor drifted over the willow walls, distinct from the sulphurous smell of the black powder. It was the scent of burning cellulose, of dry stalks catching fire. A soldier near the gate lifted his head, sniffing the air like a startled animal. He turned to Colvin, his eyes wide in his blackened face. Before he could speak, a thin column of gray smoke rose from the grass 300 yards upwind. Then another appeared to the left, and a third to the right. The warriors were lighting the field at multiple points, creating a line of ignition that spanned the entire southern horizon. The flames took hold with terrifying speed. The dry vegetation, deprived of moisture for months, combusted almost instantly. The small columns of smoke merged into a single darkening curtain that began to roll toward the corral. The crackling sound of the fire was audible now, a sharp snapping noise that grew louder with each passing second, sounding like 1,000 dry twigs breaking at once. The wind caught the flames, bending them forward, feeding them oxygen and driving them toward the wooden walls of the fortification. The strategy was primal and absolute. They would burn the defenders out of their hole or roast them alive inside it. Inside the corral, the realization of the danger caused a ripple of panic that threatened to break the discipline of the unit. The men looked at the willow walls, dry wood woven with dry branches, and saw their own pyre. If the fire reached the logs, the structure would go up in minutes. The heat would be survivable only by fleeing into the open where the warriors were waiting to cut them down. Colvin stood up, ignoring the risk of sniper fire, and shouted to be heard over the rising roar of the approaching inferno. "Clear the wall!" he bellowed. "Get the wagons back! Scrape the ground!" The lethargy of exhaustion vanished, replaced by the frantic energy of survival. Men dropped their rifles and grabbed shovels, axes, and even mess plates. They attacked the ground along the southern interior wall, scraping away the loose hay, the wood chips, and the dry manure. They worked with a desperate intensity, tearing their fingernails on the hard clay, trying to create a firebreak inside the perimeter. The teamsters whipped the mules, forcing the heavy wagons away from the threatened sector, jamming them into the center of the corral. The animals were terrified. They smelled the smoke and saw the orange glow rising above the logs. They plunged and kicked, their eyes rolling white, threatening to trample the men who were trying to save them. The wall of fire grew taller as it consumed the denser patches of grass. The flames leapt 10 feet into the air, a solid sheet of orange and red that obscured the view of the bluffs. The heat radiating from the fire front began to arrive ahead of the flames. It was a physical pressure, a blast furnace wind that seared the lungs and dried the sweat on the skin instantly. The temperature inside the corral spiked. Men gasped for air, wrapping wet rags, if they had them, or dry cloth around their faces to filter the smoke that was now pouring over the walls. The smoke was thick and choking, stinging the eyes and reducing visibility to a few yards. The defenders were blinded, coughing and hacking, tears streaming down their soot-stained cheeks. The warriors used the smoke as a screen. They advanced behind the fire line, moving in the wake of the heat, using the chaos to close the distance. They fired blindly into the smoke, their bullets and arrows disappearing into the gray haze. The defenders could not see targets. They could only fire at the orange glow, sending rounds into the inferno in the hope of hitting something solid. The sound of the fire became a roar, drowning out the gunshots, a deafening background noise that isolated each man in his own private hell. Colvin moved to the southern wall, shielding his face with his arm. He peered through a gap in the logs, trying to gauge the distance of the flames. They were less than 50 yards away and closing fast. The heat was intense enough to blister paint. He could see the individual stalks of grass curling and disintegrating in the fire. He knew that if the wind did not change, or if the fire did not run out of fuel, they were dead. He looked at the men around him. They were huddled against the north wall, as far from the heat as they could get, their weapons clutched to their chests. They were waiting for the end. Then the caprice of the high plains weather intervened. The wind, which had been driving the fire with malicious intent, suddenly faltered. The flag that hung limp on a pole near the lieutenant's body fluttered and then dropped. For a moment, the air was still. The fire stood up straight, its forward momentum checked. Then a gust came from the north. It was a strong, cool current of air rolling off the Bighorn Mountains. When the flames rolled to within 20 feet of the barricade, they stopped as if arrested. The fires forward. Momentum died, and the roar turned into a ragged crackle. The flames rose into a wall at least 40 feet high, then guttered and died with a sudden slapping collapse. The wall of fire collapsed into a line of smoldering, creeping flames that lacked the energy to bridge the final gap to the corral. A collective gasp of relief went through the defenders. They watched as the fire bent away from them, the smoke drifting back toward the enemy. The immediate threat of incineration had passed, but the danger was not over. The smoke, though moving away, still hung heavy over the field, creating a twilight gloom in the middle of the afternoon. The warriors, frustrated by the failure of the fire, decided to use the obscuration for a final, desperate assault. They would use the smoke and the confusion to breach the walls before the air cleared. The attack came from the west, through the drifting haze. A large body of warriors, dismounted and moving on foot, charged out of the smoke. They were silent this time. No war cries, just the sound of moccasins on dirt. They emerged from the gray gloom like specters less than 30 yards from the walls. The defenders, their eyes streaming and their lungs raw, were caught off guard. The first warning was the thud of bodies hitting the outside of the logs. The warriors were trying to climb over to physically dismantle the fortification. "They're on the wall!" a sergeant screamed, his voice cracking. The paralysis broke. The soldiers rushed back to the loopholes. The range was point blank. A soldier thrust the muzzle of his Springfield through a gap and pulled the trigger without aiming. The heavy recoil slammed into his shoulder. On the other side, a warrior fell back, clutching his chest. The fighting became visceral and intimate. There was no room for ballistics. It was a matter of shoving the gun in the enemy's face and firing. Al Colvin ran to the threatened sector. He climbed up on a wagon wheel to fire over the top of the logs. He looked down into the upturned faces of the attackers. They were right there, close enough to touch. He worked the lever of his Henry rifle, firing downward. The brass casing spun through the air, landing in the dirt inside the corral. He fired until the hammer clicked on an empty chamber. He dropped the rifle and drew his revolver, firing 6 more shots into the mass of men trying to scale the willow wickerwork. The warriors were trying to grab the barrels of the soldiers' rifles through the loopholes. A tug of war ensued over a weapon. A soldier kicked against the logs, bracing himself, pulling back on the stock, while a warrior outside pulled on the barrel. The soldier shouted a curse and pulled the trigger. The gun roared, and the tension on the barrel was released instantly. The sheer brutality of the struggle was exhausting. Men were panting, sweating, and bleeding. The smoke swirled around them, hiding the true number of the attackers, making it feel as though the entire Sioux nation was clawing at the wood. Zeke Colvin and the other civilians brought their repeating rifles to bear on the flanks of the assault. They moved to the corners of the corral, creating a crossfire that swept the base of the western wall. The rapid fire of the Spencers and Henrys cut through the smoke, creating a barrier of metal that the warriors could not push through. The attackers, taking heavy casualties and unable to gain a foothold on the slippery vertical logs, began to fall back. They retreated into the smoke, dragging their wounded with them, vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. The cessation of the assault left the defenders trembling. The adrenaline dump left them weak and nauseous. They slid down the walls, sitting in the dirt, their chests heaving. The smoke began to lift slowly, carried away by the north wind. The sun was lower now, dipping toward the horizon, its light turning a deep, angry orange that matched the color of the dying fire. The field. Around the corral was a blackened wasteland. The grass was gone, replaced by a carpet of ash and charred stalks. The bodies of the fallen warriors lay dark against the black ground, grim markers of the failed charge. The heat from the burned ground radiated toward the corral, keeping the temperature high even as the evening approached. The smell was overpowering, burnt grass, burnt flesh, and the stench of fear. The men checked their ammunition. They were running low. The crates that had been full in the morning were now nearly empty. They scavenged cartridges from the pockets of the dead and wounded. Every round was counted, wiped clean of grit, and loaded with care. They knew they could not withstand another assault like that. Colvin walked the perimeter again. He looked at the men. Their faces were masks of soot with white circles around their eyes where they had rubbed them. They looked like demons or ghosts. He checked the water barrel. It was dry. The thirst was now a torture. Men were trying to suck moisture from pebbles or pieces of leather. The dehydration was affecting their cognitive functions. Reactions were slow. Speech was slurred. The victory of repelling the fire and the charge felt hollow against the biological reality of their condition. The sun touched the tops of the western mountains at 5:30. The shadows lengthened, stretching across the valley floor, swallowing the blackened ground. The light began to fade, robbing the soldiers of their long-range visibility. The fear of the night began to set in. If the warriors attacked in the dark, the rifles would be less effective. The numbers would count for more. The men looked at the sun, silently pleading with it to stay, even though it had been their enemy all day. The warriors, too, were exhausted. The fire had been their gambit, and it had failed. They had lost many men. The trapdoor rifles had broken every charge. The spirit of the coalition was fraying. They pulled back to the river, and the ravines, out of range of the guns. They regrouped, tending to their wounds, drinking from the river that was denied to the soldiers. The sounds of their mourning songs began to drift on the wind, a mournful, high-pitched wailing that chilled the blood of the listeners in the corral. Colvin sat on a crate, his rifle across his knees. He was tired in his bones. He looked at the charred landscape. The fire had cleared the field of fire, removing the cover the warriors had used to creep close. In a way, the fire had helped them. It had destroyed the tall grass that had been the enemy's ally. Now anyone approaching the walls would be visible against the black earth. It was a small mercy, a tactical accident that might buy them the night. The lieutenant's body lay where it had fallen, covered by a blanket that was now gray with ash. The flies had settled on the covering, a black, buzzing carpet. The reality of death was heavy in the enclosure. 19 men and 6 civilians had held off an army. But the cost was etched in their faces. They were aged by the day. The young soldiers looked like old men. The civilians looked like stone. As the twilight deepened, the glow of the smoldering grass fires provided a faint, eerie illumination. Small fires flickered across the valley like campfires of a ghostly army. The smoke hung in low pockets, white and ghostly in the failing light. The wind continued to blow from the north, cooling the air slightly, a caress on the burned skin of the defenders. It was the first physical comfort they had felt in 12 hours. Colvin stood up. He motioned for the men to stay at the walls. "Eyes open," he croaked. "They might come one more time." He did not believe it, but he could not afford to be wrong. The Hayfield fight was winding down, not because of a truce, but because of the sheer physical limits of the human body. The fire had been the crescendo. Now came the long, silent wait for the darkness and whatever it held. The wall of fire had failed, but the wall of night was approaching, and it was just as impenetrable. The sun began to dip below the jagged peaks of the western mountains toward sundown on August 1st, 1867. The light that bathed the Bighorn Valley shifted from the harsh white of midday to a bruised purple and deep crimson, lengthening the shadows until they stretched across the blackened, ash-covered ground, like grasping fingers. Inside the willow log corral, the 19 soldiers and 6 civilians remained frozen in their defensive postures, their eyes red-rimmed and vacant, staring out at the smoke-hazed horizon. They were men hollowed out by 8 hours of continuous combat, their bodies pushed past the point of fatigue into a numb, trembling state of existence. The silence that had settled over the field was not peaceful. It was heavy and threatening, broken only by the low moans of the wounded and the coarse rasp of dry throats trying to swallow. Al Colvin sat near the gate, his hands resting on his knees, his Henry rifle leaning against his shoulder. He watched the ridges to the west, the direction of the fort. The skepticism of the frontier had taken deep root in his mind. He did not expect rescue. He expected the night to bring the knife and the club. But then the earth began to vibrate again. It was a familiar sensation, one they had felt in the morning with the arrival of the warrior coalition. But this rhythm was different. It was heavier, more regimented. It was the synchronized thud of shod hooves and the iron grinding of heavy wagon wheels, accompanied by the clanking of sabers and the jingle of cavalry bits. A new dust cloud rose above the ridgeline, distinct against the darkening sky. The defenders tensed, raising their rifles with shaking hands, fearing a fresh wave of attackers. But as the column crested the rise, the silhouette was unmistakable. It was not the irregular flowing mass of the tribes. It was the solid geometric block of United States troops. The relief column from Fort C.F. Smith had finally arrived. Colonel Luther P. Captain Burrows rode at the head of Company G, with Lieutenant Fenton bringing a detachment of Company H and a mountain howitzer behind him, sent out under Colonel Luther P. Bradley's orders. The reaction of the warrior coalition to this new arrival was immediate and pragmatic. They had spent the day hammering against a wall of rapid fire, losing men to a technology they could not counter. The arrival of fresh troops armed with the same weapons and supported by artillery altered the equation of risk beyond what was acceptable. The chiefs on the high ground signaled the withdrawal. It was not a routed panic, but a peeling away. The warriors in the river bottom and the ravines began to melt back into the landscape. They gathered their dead and wounded, slinging bodies between ponies or dragging them on travois, disappearing into the folds of the earth with the eerie silence of ghosts. Within minutes, the thousands who had besieged the hayfield were gone, leaving only the dead and the dying to mark their passage. Inside the corral, there was no cheering. The men were too dry to shout. They simply slumped against the logs, the tension leaving their bodies so rapidly that some of them shook uncontrollably. The barricade at the gate was dismantled, the heavy wagons pulled back by men who groaned with the effort. Captain Burrows rode into the enclosure, his horse stepping carefully over the debris of the fight. He looked around the interior, his face grim as he took in the scene. The ground was carpeted in spent brass cartridges, looking like a floor of gold in the dying light. The stench of the dead horses, the blood, and the latrine trenches was overpowering, a physical blow that made the fresh troops recoil. The first priority was water. The relief column had brought barrels of it. The defenders did not wait for cups. They crowded around the wagons, dipping their hands, their hats, or just shoving their faces into the buckets. The sensation of the cool liquid hitting their parched throats was a shock to the system. They drank with desperate animal intensity, water spilling down their chins and washing away the soot and grime in streaks. The surgeon who accompanied the relief column moved immediately to the wounded. He knelt in the dirt, his instruments clicking as he probed for bullets and arrows, working by the light of lanterns that were now being lit as the twilight deepened. Captain Burrows dismounted and approached Colvin. The contrast between the two men was stark. Burrows was clean, his uniform still holding its shape, his demeanor that of an officer on duty. Colvin was a specter of the fight, covered in black dust, his clothes torn, his eyes hard and ancient. They spoke briefly, not of heroism, but of numbers. Colvin reported the casualties. Lieutenant Sternberg and Private Navin were dead, and several were wounded, including J.G. Hollister, whose wound proved fatal the next day. Burrows listened, his gaze shifting to the willow walls. He saw the thousands of arrows sticking from the logs in the ground. The corral looked like a porcupine, bristling with shafts. It was a visual testament to the volume of fire the defenders had withstood. The recovery of the dead was a somber task. Lieutenant Sternberg's body was lifted onto a wagon bed wrapped in a blanket. The other two fallen soldiers were placed beside him. There was no time for ceremony. The relief column was exposed in the valley and the darkness was a danger. Burroughs ordered the evacuation of the hayfield. The surviving mules were hitched to the wagons. The equipment that could be salvaged was thrown aboard. The hay, the cause of the entire operation in the battle, was abandoned. The strategic imperative had shifted from harvesting resources to preserving the force. The march back to Fort C.F. Smith began under the cover of night. The column moved slowly, the cavalry screening the flanks, the infantry marching on either side of the wagons carrying the wounded. The journey was a blur of exhaustion for the survivors. They walked in a trance, their feet moving automatically. The adrenaline that had sustained them for 8 hours had crashed, leaving them with a fatigue that felt like a sickness. Every shadow looked like a warrior. Every rustle of the wind sounded like an arrow. The 2.5 miles back to the post felt longer than the entire day of fighting. When the heavy timber gates of Fort C.F. Smith swung open to admit them, it was about 8:30. The garrison had been on high alert all day, listening to the distant roar of the battle, powerless to help until the relief was organized. The return of the Hayfield detachment was met with a mixture of relief and awe. The men were helped from the wagons and led to the barracks. Food was offered, but few ate. They simply wanted to sleep, to escape the memory of the sun and the noise. The wounded were carried to the post hospital, where the surgeon began the long work of cleaning and stitching the tears in their flesh. The reckoning of the battle began the next morning, August 2nd. The officers and civilians gathered to debrief the engagement. As they pieced together the events, the magnitude of what had occurred became clear. 25 men had held a porous log corral against a force estimated between 800 and 1,000 warriors. By all conventional military logic of the time, they should have been wiped out within the first hour. The Fetterman massacre only months prior had shown that even 80 men could be overwhelmed in minutes by such numbers. The difference, they realized, lay in the copper casings that littered the floor of the corral. The trapdoor Springfield model 1866 and the repeating rifles carried by the civilians had fundamentally broken the tactical doctrine of the Plains tribes. The ability to fire 15 to 20 rounds a minute from a prone, protected position had negated the numerical advantage of the coalition. The warriors, used to the slow rhythm of the muzzle loader, had been unable to close the final 20 yards to the walls. The volume of fire had created a zone of denial that courage alone could not cross. The defenders calculated that they had fired thousands of rounds of ammunition. The sheer weight of the metal thrown downrange had acted as a physical barrier. The casualty count for the coalition forces was a subject of immediate and intense speculation. The defenders estimated they had killed or wounded dozens, perhaps hundreds of warriors. They based this on the number of bodies they had seen fall in the grass and the continuous nature of the fire. The tribes, in their oral histories, would acknowledge the severity of the fight, but often cite lower numbers. However, the strategic impact was undeniable. The coalition had brought their full strength to bear against a tiny outpost and had failed to take it. The psychological blow of this failure was significant. The belief that the soldiers were weak and easily overrun when caught in the open had been shattered by the reality of the breechloader. Al Colvin sat on the porch of the sutler's store, cleaning his Henry rifle. He scraped the carbon from the action, the metal gleaming in the morning sun. He was quiet, reflecting on the faces of the men he had killed. He knew that the war for the Bozeman Trail had changed. The days of the arrow and the lance dominating the field were ending. The industrial capacity of the East had finally reached the remote corners of the territory. The rifle in his hands was a machine, and it had turned the art of war into a mechanical process of extraction and ejection. The environment of the hayfield remained scarred by the battle. The grass was gone, burned away by the fire. The logs of the corral stood bleaching in the sun, riddled with holes. The wolves and coyotes moved in to scavenge what the warriors had left behind. The valley, once a place of pastoral labor, was now a graveyard. The army would not return to cut hay there immediately. The risk was too high, and the lesson had been learned. They would find other ways to feed the horses, or they would let them starve. The priority was now the defense of the fort itself, which felt smaller and more isolated than ever before. The soldiers of the 27th Infantry walked with a new strut in the days following the fight. They were no longer the terrified conscripts waiting for the arrow in the back. They were the men of the Hayfield Fight. They had looked the entire Sioux and Cheyenne nations in the eye and had not blinked. They polished the breech blocks of their trapdoor Springfields with a reverence usually reserved for religious icons. They knew that the mechanism was the only thing that kept them on this side of the grave. The trust in their weaponry gave them a morale boost that stiffened the spine of the entire garrison. However, the brutality of the fight left deep scars on the psyche of the survivors. Men woke up screaming in the barracks, dreaming of the fire and the suffocating heat. They flinched at the sound of a dropped pan. The thirst they had experienced stayed with them. They carried canteens everywhere, drinking constantly, unable to shake the phantom sensation of the dry, cracking tongue, the grim intimacy of the close-quarters combat, the face-to-face killing at the walls, haunted them. They had seen the humanity of their enemy up close, and they had destroyed it with brutal efficiency. The Hayfield Fight of August 1, 1867 served as a grim prelude to the wagon box fight which would occur just one day later near Fort Phil Kearny. There, another small detachment of soldiers armed with the new rifles would hold off a massive force of Red Cloud's warriors. Together, these two engagements signaled the shifting tide of the conflict. The tribes could no longer rely on overwhelming numbers to guarantee victory. The cost of attacking a fortified position defended by breechloaders was becoming too high to sustain. The war would drag on, but the tactical balance had tipped irrevocably in favor of the technology. Colonel Bradley wrote his report to headquarters detailing the engagement. He praised the coolness of the men and the effectiveness of the new arms. But his words on paper could not capture the reality of the sun, the dust, and the smell of the burning grass. He could not convey the feeling of the corral shrinking as the fire approached, or the sound of the arrows raining down like hail. Those memories belonged only to the 19 soldiers and 6 civilians who had lived it. They were the keepers of the story, a story written in willow wood and copper casings. As the days turned into weeks, the summer of 1867 faded toward autumn. The leaves on the cottonwoods along the Bighorn River turned gold and began to fall. The hay that had been cut lay rotting in the field, uncollected. The war went on, a slow grinding of cultures and ambitions. But for the men of the Hayfield detachment, the war had been distilled into a single eternal day. They had entered the corral as laborers and guards. They had emerged as the vanguard of a new era of warfare. The relief column had saved their lives, but the reckoning of what they had done and what had been done to them would last a lifetime. They had survived the fire, the arrows, and the heat. They had proven that a handful of men with the right tools and the will to use them could stand against a multitude. It was a lesson that would be studied by soldiers and warriors alike, a bloody theorem proven on the hard clay of the Montana Territory. The Hayfield fight was over, but the echo of the trapdoor rifles would ring across the plains for years to come, a mechanical knell for the old way of war,